You are not my biological child, so I conveniently forgot to put your name in the will. My father announced this at his 65th birthday gala. The room of Chicago elites erupted in laughter, expecting me to run away in tears. Instead, I walked right up to the stage, placed my gift on the podium, and ripped it to shreds right in front of his face. He called me a worthless dropout. He had no idea that torn piece of paper was the only thing standing between him and total bankruptcy. I am Maddie, 33 years old, and I just destroyed my family's $4 million empire. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. The Oak Brook Country Club was buzzing with the quiet hum of wealth and privilege. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over 100 of Chicago's most elite real estate developers, investors, and socialites. Waiters in crisp white shirts circulated with silver trays of champagne and caviar. It was the perfect setting for my father Richard to celebrate his 65th birthday. He stood at the front of the grand ballroom, a microphone in his hand, basking in the adoration of his peers. To my left sat my mother Diane, her face pulled tight by recent cosmetic procedures and a frozen, practiced smile. Next to her was my older sister Ashley, the undisputed golden child of the family, practically vibrating with vanity. Beside Ashley sat her husband Devin. He was a highly ambitious African-American investment banker whose custom-tailored suits and arrogant smirk perfectly matched his ruthless reputation in the financial district. I sat at the very end of the table wearing a simple black dress, sipping sparkling water. For years, I was the scapegoat, the quiet disappointment who dropped out of law school because the crushing anxiety of their expectations had broken me. They thought I was working as some low-level clerk. They had no idea I had spent the last decade teaching myself high finance, eventually becoming the anonymous founder and CEO of Aegis Capital, a venture capital firm currently dominating the commercial real estate market. Richard tapped his glass with a fork, commanding absolute silence. He adjusted his silk tie and looked out over the crowd. "I have built a legacy," he began, his voice booming through the speakers. "The Richard Center, my $4 million commercial development downtown, will stand for generations. It is a monument to our family name. And a legacy of this magnitude requires pure bloodlines." He paused, his eyes sliding past the wealthy investors and landing directly on me. A cruel, calculated smirk crossed his face. "Maddie," he said, speaking directly into the microphone. "Since you are not my biological child, I realize there is no space for you in my future. I have officially cut you from my will. The family trust is strictly for my real family. You have been a burden on my generosity for long enough." A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom, followed instantly by a wave of cruel, mocking laughter from his closest associates. Diane covered her mouth, feigning shock, but her eyes danced with vicious delight. She had always hated me, and now I knew exactly why. I was living proof of a past she wanted erased. Ashley leaned against Devin, openly giggling at my public humiliation. Devin just swirled the ice in his Scotch glass, looking at me with utter contempt. They expected me to shatter. They expected me to run out of the country club in tears, proving once and for all that I was the fragile, pathetic dropout they always claimed I was. I did not shed a single tear. I did not break eye contact. I slowly pushed my chair back, the wooden legs scraping loudly against the marble floor. The laughter in the room dialed down to a tense, uncomfortable murmur as I walked toward the stage. My posture was perfectly straight, my steps deliberate and unhurried. I reached into my clutch and pulled out a single folded sheet of thick parchment paper. I walked up the steps to the stage, stopping inches away from Richard. His smug expression faltered for a fraction of a second, replaced by a flicker of confusion. "I brought you a birthday gift, Richard," I said, my voice projecting clearly without the need for a microphone. I placed the folded document on the wooden podium between us. Before he could reach for it, Ashley marched up to the stage, her designer heels clicking aggressively. She snatched the paper away, waving it in the air like a piece of trash. "What is this garbage?" Ashley shrieked, her voice echoing through the ballroom. You dropped out of law school because you could not handle the pressure. You are a pathetic college dropout who can barely afford to pay rent. Do not embarrass us with your handmade trash, Maddie. We all know you have nothing to offer. I turned my gaze to my sister. The silence in the room was deafening. Every elite guest was hanging on to my next word. At least I did not buy a fake master's degree online using Diane's platinum credit card. Ashley, I said, my voice smooth and loud enough for every investor in the room to hear. How is that prestigious hospital board treating you? Do they know you cannot even read a basic balance sheet? Ashley gasped, her jaw dropping open. The color drained completely from Diane's face. Whispers immediately broke out among the socialites at the front tables. Ashley stood frozen in shock, her hand trembling as she held my document. I smoothly reached over, took the paper back from her stiff fingers, and looked directly into Richard's eyes. Like I said, a gift, I whispered. With one swift, violent motion, I ripped the thick parchment completely in half. Then I put the pieces together and ripped them again, letting the shredded squares of paper flutter down onto the podium like snow. I turned my back on my father, my sister, and the entire ballroom of stunned guests. I walked down the center aisle, my head held high, ignoring the frantic whispers and shocked stares. I pushed open the heavy oak doors of the country club and stepped out into the cool night air. Back inside the ballroom, the silence was suffocating. Richard stared at the torn pieces of paper on the podium, his brow furrowed in confusion. Devin, his instincts as an investment banker kicking in, rushed up to the stage. He shoved Ashley aside and began frantically piecing the shredded documents together on the wood surface. As the letters aligned, Devin's breath hitched. He grabbed Richard's arm, his fingers digging into the expensive suit fabric. Devin choked out his voice entirely devoid of its usual arrogance. Look at the letterhead. Richard leaned in his reading glasses, slipping down his nose. The golden embossed logo at the top of the paper was unmistakable. It was Aegis Capital, the only venture capital firm in the entire country capable of buying out the massive toxic debt that was secretly drowning the Richard Center project. Without that specific bailout, Richard would lose everything to foreclosure by Monday morning. Devin's hands shook violently as he aligned the bottom half of the torn page. As a high-level banker, he knew instantly what he was looking at. It was a fully executed $4 million bailout guarantee, completely wiping out Richard's toxic debt and saving the entire family from total financial ruin. But because it was torn, the legal binding was completely voided. And right below the voided terms, the signature block rested clearly in plain sight. It read, Madeline, Chief Executive Officer, Aegis Capital. Richard collapsed backward into a chair, his face turning the color of ash. His chest heaved as he struggled to draw breath. The room spun around him as the horrifying truth finally registered. The worthless college dropout he had just publicly disowned and humiliated was the billionaire savior he had been desperately begging his brokers to get a meeting with all year. And he had just forced her to destroy his only lifeline. The crisp Chicago wind hit my face the moment I pushed through the heavy brass doors of the Oak Brook Country Club. I did not run. I walked with the steady, measured pace of a woman who had just watched a 20-year nightmare finally burn to the ground. My heels clicked rhythmically against the cobblestone walkway leading to the valet line. Before I could even hand my ticket to the attendant, the club doors burst open behind me. Madeline, stop right there. Richard's voice, usually a booming instrument of authority, cracked with raw panic. I turned slowly. The entire royal family was marching toward me under the amber glow of the parking lot streetlights. Richard was at the front, his face flushed a dangerous shade of crimson, clutching the shredded pieces of the Aegis Capital contract in his trembling fists. Diane trailed closely beside him, struggling to maintain her balance in her designer heels. Ashley and Devin brought up the rear, both looking absolutely furious and ready for a fight. You tape this back together right now, Richard demanded, shoving his hands toward my chest. His chest heaved with heavy breaths. You call whoever you need to call at Aegis. Tell them it was a mistake. Tell them the CEO is a personal friend of yours and you ripped the wrong document. Do you understand me? You are going to fix this tonight, or I will ruin whatever pathetic life you have built for yourself. I looked from the torn parchment in his hands to the wild desperation in his eyes. I do not work for you anymore, Richard, and I certainly do not perform magic tricks for men who just publicly disowned me in front of 100 people. Ashley lunged forward, pointing a manicured finger directly at my face. You stupid, ungrateful brat! Do you have any idea what you just did? You just humiliated Dad in front of the entire board of directors. You are going to get on your knees and fix this, or I swear to God, I will make sure you never show your face in this city again. Before I could respond, Devin stepped between us. He was a towering man, and he used every inch of his height to intimidate me. He stood so close I could smell the expensive scotch on his breath. He adjusted his suit jacket, wearing that arrogant, untouchable smirk he used to bully junior analysts at his investment bank. Let us be very clear about how this is going to play out. Maddie. Devin set his voice a low, threatening rumble designed to strike fear. You are a nobody. You have a checking account with what may be $5,000 in it. I sit on the executive board of the largest commercial bank in the Midwest. If you do not walk back inside and convince whoever actually runs Aegis Capital to honor this bailout, I will personally freeze every financial asset you have. I will flag your accounts for suspicious activity. I will make sure your landlord evicts you by Monday, and you will not even be able to buy a cup of coffee. You do not play games with real power. You are out of your league. I stared up at Devin, feeling completely unfazed by a threat that would have terrified me 5 years ago. That is a very bold strategy, Devin, I replied evenly. Using federal banking infrastructure to exact a personal vendetta. I am sure the regulatory boards would love to hear about that. My mother Diane let out a sharp cry of rage. She pushed past Devin and swung her hand hard. The slap echoed across the quiet parking lot, the sting of her diamond rings biting into my cheek. My head snapped to the side, and a warm metallic taste filled my mouth. How dare you speak to Devin that way? Diane shrieked, her perfectly maintained facade completely shattered. You owe us everything. You are an illegitimate burden, a stain on my marriage that I tolerated for 33 years. We fed you. We clothed you. We gave you a roof over your head when you deserved nothing. You are going to fix Richard's project right now, or I will personally see you thrown onto the streets where you belong. I slowly turned my head back to face them. I raised my hand and wiped a thin trail of blood from the corner of my lip. Then I smiled. It was not a smile of submission. It was the smile of a predator watching its prey step blindly into a trap. Diane took a sudden step back, deeply unnerved by my reaction. Devin, I said, ignoring my mother entirely and focusing my absolute attention onto my brother-in-law. Do you remember that matte black Porsche 911 you bought 7 years ago? The one you used to celebrate your promotion to vice president? Devon frowned, clearly thrown off by the sudden bizarre change in subject. What are you talking about? I remember it vividly. I continued, my voice dangerously calm. Because my credit was practically perfect back then, and you convinced me to co-sign the auto loan. You told me it was just a formality to speed up the paperwork. But what you did not tell me was that you manipulated the income verification documents. You inflated your base salary by 300% using forged W-2 forms from your own bank to secure a better interest rate. That is wire fraud, Devin. A federal offense punishable by severe prison time. Devin's arrogant smirk vanished instantly. His eyes darted nervously toward Richard and Ashley. You are bluffing, he stammered, his voice losing its bass. That was years ago. Fraud has a very generous statute of limitations when concealed by a banking executive, I replied. I kept copies of every single document you forced me to sign. Every forged signature. Every fake pay stub. I have had them sitting in a secure digital vault, just waiting for the exact right moment to see the light of day. You are insane! Ashley yelled, though her voice wavered with severe uncertainty. She grabbed Devin's arm, shaking him. Devin, tell her she is lying. Tell her to shut up. Devin did not answer. He was staring at me, the color rapidly draining from his face. The intimidating, cutthroat investment banker was suddenly looking at the quiet sister-in-law he had bullied for years and realizing he had walked directly into his own destruction. Right on cue, Devon's phone began to vibrate violently in his breast pocket. The sudden harsh noise made everyone flinch. He slowly pulled the phone out, his eyes widening in horror as he read the caller ID. It was his bank's chief risk officer. "Answer it," I suggested softly. "It is probably bad news." Devon swiped the screen with a trembling thumb and brought the phone to his ear. "Yes," he answered, his voice barely a whisper. He listened for exactly 10 seconds. I watched his knees physically buckle. He had to lean heavily against the hood of a parked SUV to keep from collapsing onto the pavement. "What do you mean the entire toxic debt portfolio was sold?" Devon gasped into the phone, panic stripping away every single ounce of his corporate polish. "To who bought it?" "An anonymous buyer. If that portfolio collapses, I am going to federal prison." He dropped the phone. It clattered loudly onto the asphalt, the screen shattering. He looked at me, sheer unadulterated terror in his eyes. The valet pulled up smoothly, stopping a sleek midnight black Maybach right in front of us. The driver quickly stepped out, rounding the vehicle to open the rear door for me with a crisp bow. Richard, Diane, and Ashley stood frozen like statues. Their eyes darted from Devon's trembling, broken form to the $500,000 luxury vehicle idling quietly in front of me. The reality of my massive wealth, my absolute power, and the total destruction I had just orchestrated was finally sinking into their minds. They had poked a bear, and the bear owned the entire forest. I stepped into the plush leather interior of the Maybach and rolled the window down just enough to look my family in the eyes one last time. "I strongly suggest you all find a good defense attorney by Monday morning," I said, my tone as cold and unforgiving as the Chicago wind. "See you in court." The tinted window glided shut completely, cutting off Ashley's sudden, desperate scream. As the Maybach pulled away from the country club, leaving them in the dust, I pulled out my phone and opened a secure, encrypted messaging app. The game was no longer about survival. It was about absolute dismantling. By Tuesday morning, Devon and Ashley launched their counterattack. They were terrified, cornered, and entirely predictable. My secure phone buzzed at 6 o'clock in the morning with an urgent alert from Marcus, my chief operating officer. I opened the link he sent. It was a prominent Wall Street gossip blog, the kind that thrived on destroying reputations before breakfast. The headline read, "The Phantom of Aegis Capital. Is the industry's most ruthless CEO a mentally unstable college dropout?" The article was a masterclass in vicious anonymous slander. It was clearly dictated by Ashley, filled with intimate family details only she would know. It outlined my breakdown during my first year of law school. It mocked my inability to handle basic coursework, spinning my severe clinical anxiety into a diagnosis of dangerous, unpredictable hysteria. It painted me as a fragile fraud who had spent years hiding from the real world. But Devon had added his own lethal financial poison. The source accused me of falsifying my Series 7 and Series 63 financial licenses, claiming that the foundation of Aegis Capital was built entirely on regulatory fraud and shadow money. By 8 o'clock in the morning, the story had been picked up by Business Insider and Bloomberg's secondary feeds. Devon was actively using his vast network of media contacts to pour gasoline on the fire. He wanted to destroy my credibility so completely that my threat to his bank would look like the ravings of a lunatic. He wanted to make me radioactive. The fallout was instantaneous and brutal. In the high-stakes world of venture capital, trust is your only currency. My private line began ringing non-stop. Partners from 2 major European funds threatened to pull their pending capital injections. The stock prices of our subsidiary partners began to tremble. By noon, my board of directors called an emergency virtual meeting. I sat at the head of my long glass conference table, watching the grid of wealthy, panicked faces on the screen. One of our lead investors, a conservative billionaire from Boston, leaned into his camera with a deeply severe expression. He demanded a swift and overwhelming public response. He insisted I needed to issue a press release immediately, step down temporarily as CEO, and submit to an independent psychological evaluation to appease the volatile markets. They were spooked by the allegations of falsified federal licenses. Devin had hit the one nerve that could potentially unravel my empire. He thought my silence over the weekend was a sign of weakness. He thought he had me backed into a corner where my only option was surrender. I did not panic. I did not offer a tearful explanation. I looked directly into the camera lens and told the board of directors to hold their positions for exactly 24 hours. I absolutely refused to issue a defensive public statement. Denials only feed the media beast and make you look guilty. Instead, I ended the call, locked my office, and took the private elevator down to the basement level of the Aegis building. This was the domain of my digital forensics team, a highly specialized group of ex-cybersecurity operatives I paid exceptionally well to protect my anonymous status. I handed my lead technician, a brilliant, cynical hacker named Silas, the links to the anonymous blogs. I told him to strip away the proxy servers and trace the data packets back to their absolute origin. Devin was a corporate shark, but he was not a technological genius. He assumed standard commercial VPNs and encrypted email accounts would hide his tracks. He underestimated the resources of a firm that routinely hunted down corporate espionage. It took Silas less than 3 hours. He pulled up a global map on his massive central monitor, tracing a glowing red line past routing hubs in Eastern Europe, bouncing it back to North America, and dropping a digital pin directly onto a sleek skyscraper in downtown Chicago. Silas zoomed in, isolating the exact IP address and the MAC address of the physical machine used to upload the defamatory financial documents and contact the reporters. I smiled, feeling a cold rush of pure victory. Devin had not just used his personal computer at home. His massive ego had driven him to use his highly monitored SEC-regulated secure banking terminal at his own firm. He had utilized his employer's federally insured network to distribute falsified financial claims designed to manipulate the market against a rival firm. Silas printed the raw data logs, placed them in a stark manila folder, and handed it to me across the server rack. He asked which major news outlet I wanted to send it to. He assumed I wanted a public execution, a massive headline to clear my name, shame my sister, and destroy my brother-in-law in the court of public opinion. I took the heavy folder from his hands and shook my head. The press would just turn this into a messy, protracted family drama. Media scandals eventually fade away. Federal indictments do not. I returned to my top-floor office and bypassed my public relations department entirely. I sat at my desk, opened an encrypted browser, and navigated directly to the Securities and Exchange Commission's whistleblower portal. I uploaded the IP traces, the MAC address logs, and a concise, devastating report outlining Devin's active market manipulation from a secure corporate bank terminal. I hit submit, setting a silent, invisible ticking time bomb right under Devin's custom leather desk chair. He thought we were fighting a petty public relations battle. He did not realize I had just triggered a federal investigation. The submission confirmation screen glowed a sterile green, signaling that the federal wheels were officially in motion. I closed the encrypted browser, knowing the SEC would take at least a few days to build their warrant against Devin. I had time to deal with the rest of the family. The next morning, the war shifted from the financial sector to the social arena. I was sitting in the back of my car reviewing acquisition contracts when my assistant sent me an urgent audio link. It was the latest episode of the Gold Coast Whisper, Chicago's most prominent high society podcast. The host was notorious for destroying reputations over afternoon tea. Today's special guest was my mother. I tapped play and Diane's trembling, tearful voice filled the quiet interior of my car. She was putting on the performance of a lifetime. "It breaks a mother's heart," Diane sobbed into the microphone, her voice dripping with manufactured anguish. "We took Madeline in. We loved her despite the circumstances of her birth. Richard raised her as his own flesh and blood. But she was always so bitter, always so resentful of Ashley's natural grace and success. And now, out of pure venomous jealousy, she is trying to tear down the family that gave her everything. She is unhinged. We are actually terrified for her mental state." The host made sympathetic noises, eating up every single dramatic lie. Diane continued to paint herself as the tragic, loving matriarch victimized by an illegitimate psychotic daughter who was using a fake corporate title to exact petty revenge. She completely omitted the part where they humiliated me on stage. She omitted the $4 million debt. She spun a fairy tale of my supposed madness to protect their social standing. I switched off the audio just as my driver pulled up to the glass doors of the Aegis Capitol building. I stepped out onto the sidewalk and was immediately blinded by the flash of a camera. A reporter from a local tabloid lunged forward, shoving a digital recorder practically into my teeth. Madeline. What is your response to your mother's claims on the podcast this morning? The reporter shouted, blocking my path. Are you actively trying to sabotage the Richard Center out of sibling jealousy? Have you falsified your position at Aegis Capital? My private security detail stepped in instantly, forming a solid wall of muscle between me and the screaming journalist. I did not break my stride. I did not raise my hands to block the cameras. I kept my face entirely impassive, a mask of absolute corporate indifference. Engaging with a street reporter would only give Diane's desperate narrative credibility. I walked into the grand lobby of my building and stepped into the private elevator. By the time I reached my office, I knew exactly how to handle Diane. A public denial was beneath me, but a private, devastating reality check was absolutely necessary. My mother was a creature of intense habit. It was a Thursday morning, which meant she was holding court at her favorite high-end boutique on Oak Street. It was an exclusive invitation-only showroom where wealthy wives drank imported champagne and spent their husbands' money while gossiping about their peers. I checked my watch. She would be at the register right now. I left my office instructing my driver to head directly to the Gold Coast shopping district. When I walked through the heavy glass doors of the boutique, the air smelled of expensive perfume and fresh lilies. I spotted Diane immediately. She was standing near the polished marble checkout counter, surrounded by three of her wealthiest country club cronies. She was basking in the glow of their sympathy, loudly recounting the trauma of dealing with an ungrateful child. I simply do not know where she gets this vicious streak, Diane sighed dramatically, holding up a diamond tennis bracelet to the mirror. Richard is heartbroken. We just have to pray she gets the psychiatric help she clearly needs. Her friends murmured their agreements, shooting her pitying looks. Diane turned to the boutique manager and placed the tennis bracelet along with 3 silk gowns onto the counter. She handed over her signature platinum credit card with a practiced flick of her wrist. I stood quietly near a display of leather handbags entirely unnoticed and watched the show unfold. The manager swiped the card. A sharp negative beep echoed over the quiet hum of the store. The manager frowned and ran the card again. Another beep. He looked up, his face tight with professional discomfort. I am so sorry, Mrs. Wilson, the manager said, lowering his voice. The card has been declined. Diane's practiced smile completely vanished. Her friends suddenly went dead silent. That is impossible, Diane snapped, snatching the card back. The bank must have flagged it for fraud protection because of the high amount. Run this one instead. She pulled out a different card and slammed it on the marble. The manager ran it. Declined. Diane's hands began to shake. She frantically dug into her designer purse, pulling out a third card, then a fourth. Declined. Declined. The federal agencies were moving faster than I anticipated. Devon's bank accounts were clearly undergoing a massive internal freeze, and the ripple effect had just hit Richard's heavily leveraged credit lines. Diane was standing in the middle of her favorite sanctuary, utterly bankrupt in front of the very women she spent her life trying to impress. Her friends took a collective awkward step back. The humiliation radiating from Diane was thick enough to choke on. She stared at the rejected plastic cards, her face turning a deep mottled red. I stepped out from behind the display and walked gracefully up to the counter. Diane gasped, her eyes widening in pure shock as I stepped right beside her. I did not say a word to my mother. I simply opened my clutch, pulled out my solid titanium American Express Centurion card, and handed it to the manager. Put Mrs. Wilson's items on this, please, I said, my voice projecting clearly across the silent boutique. The manager quickly processed the heavy black card. It approved instantly. He handed me the receipt. I signed it with a smooth flourish and slid the card back into my clutch. Diane's friends stared at me in absolute awe. The supposedly unhinged broke dropout had just casually dropped $40,000 to save her mother from public humiliation. Diane was shaking with rage and mortification. "You think you can embarrass me?" she hissed under her breath, glaring at me with raw hatred. "You think paying for my things makes you look like the bigger person? You are nothing." I turned to Diane, stepping so close she had to crane her neck to look at me. I maintained a perfectly pleasant, polite smile for the benefit of her friends watching us. "I am not trying to be the bigger person, Diane," I whispered, keeping my voice so low, only she could hear the ice in my tone. "I am just paying my respects to the dead," Diane sneered. "What are you talking about?" I leaned in a fraction closer, my lips hovering right next to her ear. "Did you ever bother to check who bought this commercial building last month? Aegis Capital owns this entire block. Your favorite boutique's lease was up for renewal yesterday. I just personally denied the extension. They are being evicted next week and the building is being gutted. You will never set foot in here again." Diane's mouth fell open. The color drained from her face so fast she looked like a ghost. Her perfectly manicured hands went entirely slack, and the heavy shopping bags slipped through her fingers. They hit the marble floor with a loud final thud. I left Diane standing paralyzed amidst the ruins of her social standing. By the time I arrived back at the Aegis Capital headquarters, the adrenaline had settled into a cold, sharp focus. I bypassed the main reception and took my private elevator up to the executive suite. The floor-to-ceiling windows of my office offered a commanding view of the Chicago skyline, a constant reminder of the empire I had built from nothing. I had barely settled into my leather chair when the heavy glass doors of my office swung open. My security protocol is flawless, yet Devin strolled in as if he owned the entire building. He wore a smug, infuriating grin, adjusting the cuffs of his bespoke suit. He looked like a man who believed he had already won the war. "Your lobby security is surprisingly easy to bypass when you possess top-tier federal banking credentials," Devin announced, dropping his briefcase directly onto my polished mahogany desk. He leaned over, planting both hands on the glass surface to loom over me. "I figured you might want a face-to-face meeting after the absolute bloodbath your firm took in the press yesterday." I leaned back in my chair and crossed my arms, maintaining a perfectly level gaze. "You are trespassing, Devin. That is an incredibly bold move for a man whose financial institution is currently under a severe microscope." Devin let out a sharp, arrogant laugh. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick, legal-sized manila envelope. He extracted a stack of heavily redacted documents and slid them across the desk until they rested inches from my hands. "Let us skip the corporate posturing, Madeline," he said, pulling up a chair and sitting down without an invitation. "Here's the stark reality of your situation. Your board of directors is panicking. Your European investors are threatening to pull their massive capital injections. The financial blogs are eating you alive and the market hates volatility. But I am a reasonable man. I brought a mutually beneficial solution." I glanced at the top page. It was a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement paired with a fully drafted funding contract. The terms were identical to the original paper I had ripped up at the country club. $4 million transferred directly to the Richard Center Holding Company to instantly cover their massive toxic debt. "Sign the bailout," Devin instructed, his tone dripping with fake sympathy. "You sign over the $4 million to save your father's legacy, and I will personally call off the media dogs. I will issue a full retraction through my anonymous sources. I will tell the press that the rumors about your mental instability and falsified licenses were fabricated by a disgruntled former employee. The scandal completely disappears, your board calms down, and we all walk away clean. It is a win for everyone." I stared at him, marveling at his absolute unchecked delusion. "You orchestrated a targeted, vicious defamation campaign against me, and now you want me to pay you $4 million to stop it. That is textbook extortion, Devin." "It is leverage," he corrected, pointing a manicured finger at me. "And you are going to take the deal because you have absolutely no other choice. If you refuse, the articles we published yesterday will look like child's play compared to what I drop tomorrow morning." He leaned closer, lowering his voice into a theatrical, menacing whisper. Do you really think Diane never told me the truth about your biological father? The man was a convicted felon. He served a decade in federal prison for racketeering and grand larceny before he died. How do you think the conservative old money investors at Aegis Capital will react when they find out their brilliant CEO is the direct offspring of a career criminal? I have the sealed court records, Madeline. I have his mugshot. If I leak that to the Wall Street Journal, your pristine reputation is permanently destroyed. The board will vote you out by Friday afternoon. Devon sat back, crossing his legs, looking incredibly pleased with himself. He expected me to shatter. He expected tears begging or a frantic grab for a pen to sign his ridiculous contract. Instead, I slowly pushed his funding agreement aside, completely unbothered. I reached into the bottom drawer of my desk, retrieved a slim black folder and dropped it precisely where his contract had just been. I do not negotiate with cornered animals. Devon, I replied, my voice completely devoid of emotion. Open it. Devon frowned, his confident facade slipping for a fraction of a second. He reached out and flipped the black folder open. The top page was a highly detailed financial ledger. The second page was a series of wire transfer confirmations. The third page was a summary of offshore shell companies located entirely within the Cayman Islands. As he flipped through the documents, the color drained from his face at an alarming speed. His breathing turned shallow and rapid. His eyes darted across the pages, recognizing his own hidden account numbers. You see, Devon, I explained, steepling my fingers together. When you launched your pathetic little blog attack, I had my digital forensics team trace your IP address. But they did not stop there. Once they breached your secure banking terminal, I had them run a full diagnostic audit on your personal transaction history for the past 36 months. Devon swallowed hard, his hands beginning to tremble as he turned another page. Ashley has very expensive taste. I continued, my voice echoing off the quiet walls of my office. Summer vacations in Monaco, $50,000 Birkin bags, diamond tennis bracelets, custom sports cars. I always wondered how a vice president at a regional commercial bank could afford a lifestyle designed for billionaires. Now I know. You did not earn that money. You embezzled it. Devon tried to speak, but only a dry, raspy sound came out of his throat. You have been systematically skimming fractions of a percent off the top of your highest net worth client portfolios, I stated, laying out his crimes with brutal precision. You funneled that stolen capital through a maze of dummy corporations straight into an offshore account in the Caymans. You used millions of dollars of stolen client money to fund your wife's ridiculous vanity. This file proves every single illegal transaction down to the exact second the money moved. That is impossible, Devon choked out. The papers shook violently in his hands. You cannot access those servers. This is highly classified federal banking data. I own a venture capital firm that specializes in global cybersecurity acquisitions, Devon. There is no server on this planet I cannot access if I have a reason to look. He stared at me, his arrogant, bullying demeanor entirely gone. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a cliff, watching the ground crumble beneath his feet. He was looking at decades in federal prison. He was looking at total financial ruin, public disgrace, and the absolute destruction of his entire life. What do you want? He asked, his voice cracking. He sounded completely defeated, all the fight draining out of him. You want the $4 million contract ripped up? Fine. I will rip it up right now. I will call off the media. Just name your price. I will do whatever you want. I leaned forward, locking my eyes onto his terrified face. I do not want your retractions, Devon. And I certainly do not want your money. Here is my compromise. You have exactly 48 hours to draft a letter of immediate resignation to your bank's executive board. You will cite sudden, severe health issues. You will walk away from your job, your stock options, and your entire career in finance. You will surrender all of it by Friday at noon. Devon gasped, clutching his chest as if he could not breathe. You cannot ask me to do that. That is my entire life. If I resign suddenly, the board will launch an automatic internal audit. They will find the missing funds. They will ruin me. That sounds like a personal problem, I replied, my tone completely merciless. 48 hours, Devon. If I do not see your public resignation cross the wire by noon on Friday, I am sending this exact black folder to the SEC, the FBI Financial Crimes Division, and directly to the inbox of every single high-net-worth client you stole from. He opened his mouth to beg, his eyes filling with desperate tears, but I stood up, signaling the meeting was definitively over. Tick-tock, Devon. I suggest you go home and tell Ashley she needs to start returning those handbags. You have 48 hours. Get out of my office. The heavy glass doors of my office glided shut, perfectly sealing the absolute silence of the room. Devon was gone. He took his shattered arrogance and his doomed career with him down the private elevator. I had won the battle, but his desperate, venomous threat still lingered in the air like a toxic vapor. He had tried to weaponize my biological father against me, painting him as a convicted racketeer and a grand larcenist. I knew Richard and Diane were pathological liars. They built their entire lives on a foundation of manufactured prestige. But lies of that specific calculated magnitude always required an origin point. They needed a fixer to bury the truth. I did not involve Silas or my digital forensics team for this operation. This was blood, not business. If I was going to excavate the skeletons in Richard's closet, I needed to speak directly to the architect who built it. His name was Arthur Sterling. 30 years ago, Arthur had been Richard's lead corporate counsel, an aggressive legal attack dog. He orchestrated the rapid, ruthless expansion of the family real estate empire before quietly retiring into absolute obscurity. Tracking him down took me less than 2 hours. He was currently residing in a highly exclusive, heavily monitored assisted living facility in the northern suburbs of Chicago. I drove there myself the very next morning. The facility was pristine, smelling strongly of lemon polish and expensive floral arrangements. I bypassed the main reception desk, flashing my Aegis Capital credentials to a very intimidated floor manager, and walked straight back to Arthur's private suite. He was sitting in a leather wheelchair by a large bay window, staring out at a manicured courtyard. The ruthless corporate lawyer I remembered from my childhood had withered into a frail, hollowed-out shell of a man, but when he turned his head and locked eyes with me, I saw a sharp, immediate spark of recognition. He did not look surprised. He looked like a man who had been waiting for an executioner. Madeline, Arthur rasped, his voice sounding like dry paper rubbing together. You have your father's eyes. I always told Diane that would be a problem. I pulled up a high-backed chair and sat directly across from him, resting my hands on my knees. Devon Blackwood paid me a visit yesterday. I began, keeping my tone perfectly measured and dangerously calm. He told me my biological father was a convicted felon. He claimed there are sealed court records proving he served a decade in federal prison for racketeering. I want to know exactly what Richard and Diane did to him. Arthur let out a long, ragged sigh. His trembling hands gripped the armrests of his wheelchair. He closed his eyes, completely surrendering to the heavy weight of his own guilt. Your father was not a criminal, Madeline. Arthur confessed the ugly truth, finally breaking through 30 years of silence. His name was Thomas Vance. He was not a racketeer. He was a brilliant architectural engineer and Richard's original, absolutely equal business partner. I sat perfectly still, absorbing the massive paradigm shift taking place right in front of me. Thomas was the actual genius behind the entire operation. Arthur continued, his voice gaining a slight desperate strength. He had the vision, the blueprints, and the initial seed capital. Richard was just the charismatic salesman, but Richard was greedy. When the first major commercial development started yielding millions, Richard did not want to split the empire, so he hired me to help him steal it. Arthur forced himself to look me directly in the eyes. We engineered a massive, highly complex financial fraud. We funneled phantom debts into Thomas's personal holding accounts and fabricated an untraceable paper trail of embezzlement. We framed him completely. When the federal investigators closed in, Richard offered Diane a brutal choice. She could go down with a ruined, disgraced man, or she could marry Richard, keep the wealth, and walk away clean. She chose the money. Thomas died of a massive coronary 2 years later, completely broken and entirely innocent. The pieces of the puzzle slammed into place with staggering, violent clarity. Every single moment of my childhood suddenly made perfect, horrifying sense. The constant suffocating abuse, the vicious scapegoating, the way Diane looked at me with pure, unfiltered disgust whenever I walked into a room, the way Richard relentlessly hammered the narrative that I was an illegitimate burden, a fragile dropout who could never succeed in the real world. It was never about my anxiety. It was never about my perceived weakness. It was raw, unadulterated fear. I was the living, breathing embodiment of their original sin. I was Thomas Vance's bloodline walking around their stolen mansion. They systematically abused me, kept me small, and spent 20 years meticulously constructing a psychological cage around me because they were absolutely terrified. They knew that if I ever woke up, discovered my true strength, and realized who I actually was, I would dismantle them piece by piece and claim my rightful half of the empire they murdered my father to build. I felt a cold, terrifying calm wash over my entire body. It was the absolute absence of mercy. Arthur slowly wheeled himself backward toward a heavy oak bookshelf. He reached into a hidden space behind a row of thick legal encyclopedias and pulled out a tarnished brass key and a faded yellowed file folder. He placed them gently on the small table between us. "I kept the original partnership contracts," Arthur whispered, a tear finally escaping his weathered eye and tracking down his cheek. "I was legally ordered to shred them, but I could not do it. I have carried this sickness in my stomach for 3 decades. The key opens a safety deposit box at the First National Bank downtown. The original deed to the foundational property is inside." I reached out and picked up the heavy brass key, feeling the cold metal press into my palm. "What exactly does this deed prove, Arthur?" Arthur offered a sad, broken smile. "It proves that Richard's hostile buyout was legally void. It proves the foundational land was placed in an irrevocable trust for Thomas Vance's only heir. The Richard Center. The $4 million monument your father is currently bleeding himself dry to build is sitting on stolen ground. That land does not belong to Richard. It belongs entirely to you." I stared down at the key resting in my hand, my mind racing with the infinite possibilities of total destruction. The toxic debt drowning Richard's legacy was no longer my primary weapon. I literally owned the earth beneath his feet. How would you like me to handle the final confrontation between Maddie and Richard regarding the stolen land in the next part of the script? I gripped the heavy brass key in my palm, the cold metal anchoring me to reality. I thanked Arthur, leaving him to the quiet peace of his room, and instructed my driver to head straight to the First National Bank downtown. The journey felt entirely too short for the magnitude of what I was about to do. Within an hour, I was standing in a highly secure steel vault, unlocking a safety deposit box that had not seen the light of day in 3 decades. The heavy metal drawer slid out with a metallic groan. Inside lay a pristine yellowed envelope. I broke the brittle wax seal and pulled out the original partnership contract and the foundational deed. I traced my fingers over the faded signatures. Arthur was completely right. The land beneath the Richard Center, the multi-million-dollar project my so-called father was using to cement his legacy, was legally and irrevocably mine. I slid the fragile documents into a hard plastic sleeve and locked them inside my briefcase. Richard's ultimate destruction was fully prepared, but I was not quite ready to deliver the final blow. I had another loose end to tie up first. My phone buzzed with an urgent text from my executive assistant. She monitored the social media accounts of my family members for any erratic behavior. Today, my sister Ashley was broadcasting her location live to her thousands of followers. She was hosting a lavish invite-only brunch in the Grand Solarium of the Wellington Country Club. The Wellington was the crown jewel of Chicago high society. It was a place where generationally wealthy families gathered to gossip, drink imported champagne, and judge anyone who did not meet their impossible financial standards. Ashley practically lived there. It was her stage, her sanctuary, and the absolute center of her entire social universe. I instructed my driver to change course. When I arrived at the Wellington, I did not stop at the reception desk. I bypassed the ornate mahogany double doors and walked straight toward the grand solarium. The room was a massive sunlit greenhouse filled with crystal chandeliers, white linen tables, and towering floral arrangements. I paused just outside the archway, completely hidden behind a marble pillar, and listened. Ashley was sitting at the center of the largest table in the room, surrounded by 10 of the wealthiest, most influential women in the city. The table was practically groaning under the weight of expensive seafood towers, imported caviar, and endless bottles of vintage champagne. She held a crystal mimosa glass in one hand, gesturing dramatically with the other. Her perfectly curled blonde hair bounced as she shook her head in mock sympathy. She was putting on a masterclass in manipulation. "It has been a complete nightmare for our family." Ashley sighed loudly, ensuring her voice carried across the quiet dining room. "Madeline has completely lost her mind. Devin told me she is actually under a massive federal investigation for corporate fraud. She faked her entire career. The SEC is preparing to indict her, and she is desperately lashing out at us to cover up her own crimes." Her friends gasped in theatrical horror, leaning in closer to absorb the scandal. They were practically vibrating with excitement, thrilled to have front-row seats to the destruction of a prominent CEO. "She is going to federal prison," Ashley declared, taking a delicate sip of her drink. "Richard and Diane are heartbroken, of course. We tried to give her a good life despite her obvious mental instability, but she is just a bitter, jealous criminal. It is honestly pathetic." The sheer audacity of her lies was breathtaking. Her husband was 48 hours away from being exposed as a massive embezzler. Her parents were completely bankrupt. And yet Ashley was sitting in a luxury country club spinning a fairy tale to protect her fragile ego. I stepped out from behind the marble pillar and walked straight into the center of the grand solarium. The sharp click of my designer heels on the marble floor echoed through the room. One by one, the wealthy women at Ashley's table stopped talking and turned to stare. The color rapidly drained from Ashley's perfectly contoured face when she saw me standing there. Her mimosa glass hovered frozen near her lips. Madeline, Ashley hissed, slamming her glass down onto the table. "What are you doing here? You are not a member of this club." I offered her a cold, empty smile. "I heard you were hosting a brunch, Ashley. I thought I would drop by and hear these fascinating stories about my impending arrest in person. Please continue." "You were just explaining how I faked my entire career." Ashley stood up her chair, scraping loudly against the floor. Her face flushed a deep, angry crimson. She looked around the room, realizing that several other tables had stopped eating to watch our confrontation. She immediately fell back on her favorite defense mechanism. She threw a tantrum. "Mr. Harrison," Ashley shrieked, waving frantically toward the club manager who was rushing over. "Mr. Harrison, call security immediately. This woman is trespassing. She is completely unhinged and she is harassing my guests. I want her physically thrown out of the building right now." The general manager, a tall, distinguished man in a tailored suit, hurried into the solarium, flanked by 2 large security guards. Ashley crossed her arms, a smug, victorious grin spreading across her face. She expected me to be dragged out, kicking and screaming. She expected public humiliation. Instead, Mr. Harrison walked right past me without a single glance. He stopped directly next to Ashley's chair, his expression completely blank and strictly professional. "Mrs. Blackwood," Mr. Harrison said, keeping his voice carefully neutral, "I am going to have to ask you to lower your voice." Ashley blinked in pure confusion. "Excuse me, I am a platinum member. I demand you remove her." Mr. Harrison did not move. "Actually, Mrs. Blackwood, you are no longer a member of this club." The entire table went dead silent. Ashley's friends stared at the manager in absolute shock. Ashley's mouth fell open, her smug grin vanishing instantly. "What are you talking about? My father has been a member here for 30 years. Mr. Harrison finally turned and gestured respectfully toward me. "Ms. Vance recently finalized a major corporate acquisition. Aegis Capital purchased a controlling stake in the Wellington Hospitality Group at 9 o'clock this morning. She is the majority owner of this establishment. and she has personally directed me to review your family accounts. I stepped forward, closing the distance until I was standing right in front of my sister. I did not raise my voice. I spoke clearly, ensuring every single woman at her table heard every single word. I reviewed the financial ledgers an hour ago, Ashley, I stated smoothly. It turns out Richard has not paid his membership dues in 6 months. Diane has bounced 3 consecutive checks to the catering department. And you and Devin submitted fraudulent credit applications to upgrade to the platinum tier. Your entire family is broke. Ashley looked like she had been physically struck. She stumbled backward, bumping into the table and rattling the silverware. No, she stammered, her voice high and panicked. No, that is a lie. She is lying. I snapped my fingers, signaling the security guards. Your membership is permanently revoked, I announced, my voice echoing off the glass ceiling of the solarium. Escort Mrs. Blackwood off my property. If she resists, call the police and have her arrested for trespassing and unpaid debts. The 2 security guards stepped forward, grabbing Ashley by both arms. She shrieked, struggling wildly against their grip, but they were professionals. They marched her forcefully across the marble floor. Her designer purse slipped from her shoulder, spilling her belongings across the ground. Her wealthy friends sat frozen in absolute horror, watching the golden child of Chicago high society get dragged out of her favorite country club like a common criminal. I watched her kick and thrash her expensive heels, slipping on the polished marble. She screamed my name, a frantic, ugly sound that shattered the refined atmosphere of the country club. I did not blink. I turned to the table of stunned women who were all clutching their champagne glasses in terrified silence. Please excuse the interruption, ladies, I said, offering them a polite, chilling smile. I will personally cover the cost of your brunch today. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon. I turned my back on the silent table and walked out of the solarium. The air outside felt crisp and clean. I had dismantled Diane. I had broken Devin. I had publicly humiliated Ashley. There was only one person left on my list. It was time to deal with Richard. The news of Ashley's spectacular expulsion from the Wellington Country Club reached Richard before I even made it back to my office. I knew his reaction would be explosive, but a cornered narcissist rarely surrenders quietly. They doubled down. Richard was bleeding capital, losing his social armor, and facing the total collapse of his namesake project. He needed a miracle, and he thought he had found one. At 9 o'clock the next morning, my assistant routed a live feed to the massive flat-screen monitor on my office wall. Richard had hastily assembled a press conference on the concrete steps of the unfinished Richard Center. He stood behind a podium bristling with microphones from local and national financial news networks. Despite the deep bags under his eyes and the noticeable tension in his jaw, he wore his signature tailored suit and a practiced, arrogant smile. He tapped the microphone instantly, commanding the attention of the reporters. It has been a challenging week for Wilson Commercial Development. Richard began, projecting his voice with practiced gravitas. We have faced unprecedented market volatility, baseless rumors, and malicious attacks from disgruntled parties seeking to disrupt our vision for the city of Chicago. But true legacy cannot be derailed by petty jealousy. He paused, letting the reporters lean in. I am thrilled to announce that as of midnight last night, we have officially secured a massive comprehensive funding partnership. Richard declared, his chest puffing out with absolute triumph. We have entered into an exclusive agreement with the Oasis Fund, a premier sovereign wealth and private equity group based out of Dubai. They have recognized the unparalleled value of the Richard Center and have committed the full $4 million required to instantly clear all outstanding developmental debt. The project is fully funded and construction resumes tomorrow. The reporters immediately started shouting questions. Richard held up his hands, basking in the flash of the cameras. He looked like a man who had just cheated death. He fielded a few softball questions about the construction timeline before a reporter from a prominent financial blog shouted over the crowd. Mr. Wilson, what is your response to the aggressive moves made by Aegis Capital this week? Are you concerned about their CEO, Madeline Vance, attempting a hostile takeover of your assets? This was the moment Richard had been waiting for. I watched his face shift from triumphant businessman to a deeply concerned, patronizing patriarch. He leaned heavily onto the podium, lowering his voice to ensure maximum dramatic effect. Aegis Capital is a failed amateur firm masquerading as a legitimate financial institution, Richard stated, staring directly into the main television camera. And quite frankly, the individual running it is profoundly unstable. It is a tragedy when a troubled, estranged family member tries to use corporate sabotage to work through their personal mental health issues. Her firm is built on smoke and mirrors. But international smart money like the Oasis Fund sees right through that kind of petty, vindictive nonsense. My legacy is secure, and Aegis Capital will be bankrupt by the end of the fiscal year. I sat behind my mahogany desk, perfectly still, watching him deliver his own eulogy on live television. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee. The dark roast was bitter, but the moment was incredibly sweet. Richard was a man blinded by his own ego. He was so desperate for salvation, so desperate to maintain the illusion of his untouchable empire, that he completely abandoned his standard due diligence. If he had possessed the capital to hire a proper forensic accounting firm, they might have noticed the subtle anomalies in his new investor's corporate structure. They might have traced the Dubai routing numbers through a labyrinth of international shell companies. They might have discovered that the Oasis Fund did not exist 6 months ago. It was a phantom entity, a perfectly legal, heavily funded mirage designed exclusively by the International Acquisitions Division of Aegis Capital. I had laid the bait weeks ago, knowing Richard would eventually become desperate enough to bite without checking the hook. The heavy wooden door to my office opened, and my executive assistant Sarah walked in, holding a thick, leather-bound folio. She glanced at the television screen, where Richard was currently shaking hands with the press, and then looked back at me. "The final authorization documents require your signature, Ms. Vance," Sarah said, stepping forward and placing the folio gently onto the glass surface of my desk. I flipped the leather cover open. Inside was the master contract for the Oasis Fund. It authorized the immediate release of $4 million to Wilson Commercial Development. But the fine print buried deep within the complex legal jargon contained a series of catastrophic default triggers linked directly to the land deed I had secured from Arthur Sterling. Attached to the funding contract was an event proposal. Richard was not satisfied with a simple wire transfer. He wanted a coronation. He had rented the grand ballroom at the Palmer House Hotel for tomorrow evening. He was throwing a lavish, highly publicized signing gala to celebrate his victory. He invited the mayor, the city council, the press, and every major investor in Chicago to watch him sign the final paperwork and accept the check from the Dubai representatives. "He wants to sign the papers on a literal stage," Sarah noted, her voice carrying a trace of disbelief. "He is spending the last of his personal credit to fund the catering and the champagne. He wants the entire city to watch him win." I picked up my heavy titanium fountain pen. I unscrewed the cap aligning the gold nib with the signature line at the bottom of the authorization document. "Let him have his audience," I replied quietly. I pressed the pen to the paper and signed my name with a smooth, decisive flourish. With that single stroke of ink, I authorized the trap to snap shut. The Oasis Fund was now fully greenlit to attend the gala. I closed the leather folio and handed it back to Sarah. She took it, glancing once more at the television where Richard was practically glowing with arrogant pride. "Miss Vance." Sarah hesitated, her professional demeanor slipping for just a fraction of a second. "His entire legal team is celebrating. They have no idea who actually controls that fund. They have no idea the land deed renders their collateral entirely void. Should we send a cease and desist? Should we warn him before he gets in front of the entire city tomorrow night?" I leaned back in my executive chair, folding my hands together in my lap. I looked at Richard's smug, smiling face, frozen on the television screen. I offered Sarah a slow, razor-sharp smile. "Why warn a man who is digging his own grave with a golden shovel?" I asked softly. "Ensure the press receives prime seating at the gala tomorrow. I want every single camera pointed directly at him when the casket drops." Sarah nodded, a grim smile playing on her lips, and left the office to execute my orders. Richard's public execution was perfectly scheduled for tomorrow night. However, I still had a few hours left in my afternoon, and there was one more pressing matter that required my immediate personal attention. Ashley was exactly like a cockroach. If you did not completely crush her, she would find a dark corner to hide in and multiply. After her spectacular, humiliating eviction from the Wellington Country Club, she was desperate to secure a new pedestal to maintain her crumbling social facade. I checked my watch. Right now, Ashley was sitting in the executive boardroom of Chicago Memorial Hospital. Chicago Memorial was the most prestigious medical institution in the state. Securing a seat on their philanthropic board of directors was the ultimate status symbol for wealthy wives. It required a massive financial pledge, flawless social standing, and a verified advanced degree in business or healthcare administration. Ashley had submitted her application months ago, leveraging Devon's stolen money and a supposedly pristine academic record. What Ashley did not know was that Aegis Capital had anonymously funded the hospital's entire new pediatric oncology wing last year. I was not just a donor, I was their primary silent benefactor. My driver dropped me off at the hospital's glass entrance. I bypassed the visitor desk and took the private elevator directly to the executive floor. When I opened the heavy double doors of the boardroom, the atmosphere was thick with polite, wealthy tension. Ashley was sitting at the far end of the long mahogany table. She wore a modest tailored Chanel suit, playing the part of the sophisticated, educated philanthropist. She was in the middle of a practiced monologue, smiling charmingly at the half-dozen prominent doctors and wealthy chair members. With my Ivy League master's in healthcare economics, Ashley was saying, her voice dripping with fake humility, I feel uniquely positioned to guide this hospital's financial outreach program into a new era of prosperity and growth. I completely agree, I announced, stepping fully into the room. Ashley's voice caught in her throat. She physically recoiled, her perfectly manicured hands gripping the edge of the table. The board members turned to look at me. The chairman of the board, Dr. Alistair Sterling, immediately stood up, his face breaking into a wide, respectful smile. Ms. Vance. Dr. Sterling greeted me warmly, gesturing to an empty leather chair directly across from Ashley. We are deeply honored you could join us. We were just concluding Mrs. Blackwood's interview for the vacant board seat. I would not miss it for the world, I replied, taking my seat. I folded my hands on the polished wood and locked my eyes onto my sister. She looked like she was about to be physically sick. The color had completely vanished from her face. Mrs. Blackwood was just detailing her extensive academic background, Dr. Sterling explained, gesturing to Ashley's impressive-looking resume. An Ivy League education is quite an asset for our financial oversight committee. Indeed it is, I said, leaning forward slightly. In fact, since I am the primary underwriter for the new oncology wing, I have a vested interest in ensuring our board members possess a rigorous understanding of healthcare finance. Tell me, Ashley, given the recent fluctuations in federal funding, what is your proposed strategy for optimizing our Medicare reimbursement deficit while remaining compliant with the new ERISA regulations? The boardroom went dead silent. The doctors and financial directors turned their attention to Ashley, waiting eagerly for her expert analysis. Ashley opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her eyes darted around the room like a trapped animal. She swallowed hard, a bead of sweat forming at her temple. Well, Ashley stammered, her voice suddenly high and thin. I think that we need to focus on synergizing the community outreach with our core financial values. It is about building relationships with the patients. I did not break eye contact. I let her weak, pathetic answer hang in the air until the silence became physically uncomfortable. Dr. Sterling frowned, exchanging a confused glance with the chief financial officer sitting to his left. Synergy, I repeated flatly. Fascinating. Let us try something a bit more basic, since your master's degree specialized in economics. How would you calculate the hospital's EBITDA margin for the upcoming fiscal quarter, assuming a 7% increase in operational overhead? Ashley's hands began to visibly shake. She grabbed her water glass, nearly spilling it as she took a desperate, shaking sip. Her face was turning a mottled, blotchy red. I would have my accountants look at the spreadsheets, she blurted out, her voice cracking. That is what delegation is for. A good leader delegates the numbers to the staff. The chief financial officer actually scoffed out loud. He pushed his glasses up his nose, looking at Ashley with undisguised contempt. Mrs. Blackwood, the board of directors does not delegate financial oversight. We are the oversight. That is a fundamental entry-level question. I leaned back in my chair, projecting absolute effortless authority. It is quite shocking, Ashley. For a woman boasting a master's degree from an elite Ivy League institution, you seem completely incapable of grasping basic macroeconomic principles. One might almost assume you have never taken a graduate-level finance class in your entire life. How dare you! Ashley shrieked, slamming her hands on the table. She dropped the philanthropist act, completely reverting to the spoiled, vicious child she truly was. You are just jealous. You are a college dropout who ruined our family, and now you are trying to embarrass me in front of these important people. My degree is real. Dr. Sterling cleared his throat loudly. The sharp, authoritative sound instantly silenced Ashley's tantrum. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a thick brown manila envelope. His face was a mask of cold, professional fury. This hospital's integrity is our most valuable asset, Dr. Sterling stated, his voice echoing off the walls. We take our vetting process incredibly seriously. This morning, my office received an anonymous, highly detailed package via courier. He opened the envelope and extracted a stack of glossy papers. I watched Ashley's eyes widen in sheer terror as she recognized her own academic transcripts. This is a digital forensics report, Dr. Sterling explained, sliding the papers across the table so the entire board could see them. It traces the exact origin of your supposed Ivy League diploma. It proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that your master's degree was purchased from an online diploma mill based out of a strip mall in Nevada. You paid $3,000 for a fabricated piece of paper. The boardroom erupted into shocked, angry murmurs. The elite doctors and seasoned financial directors stared at Ashley with absolute disgust. She had tried to con her way into their sacred inner circle using a cheap, fraudulent printout. She had insulted their intelligence and compromised the reputation of a pediatric hospital to stroke her own vanity. That is a lie, Ashley cried out, her voice pitching into a hysterical wail. She set me up. Madeline fabricated those documents. You have to believe me. The package included the original credit card receipts. Mrs. Blackwood, Dr. Sterling replied, his tone laced with pure ice. Signed by your husband, Devin Blackwood. The same Devin Blackwood who is currently under federal investigation for massive corporate embezzlement. Ashley froze. The mention of Devin's crimes, the crimes I had personally exposed to the authorities just hours prior, completely broke her. The last remaining pillar of her manufactured perfect life collapsed into dust. She was entirely bankrupt, publicly disgraced, and now exposed as a pathetic, uneducated fraud in front of the exact high society crowd she worshipped. She looked at me. I was sitting perfectly still, my face a mask of absolute serene victory. I did not need to say a single word. My silence was 1,000 times more devastating than any insult. Ashley let out a loud, humiliated sob. She snatched her designer handbag off the table, her hands shaking so violently, she dropped her phone on the floor. She did not even stop to pick it up. She turned and ran out of the executive boardroom, her expensive heels echoing frantically down the hallway as she fled the building crying. Dr. Sterling sighed, gathering the fraudulent documents and sliding them back into the envelope. He turned to me, offering an apologetic nod. I apologize you had to witness that, Ms. Vance. It is deeply unfortunate when individuals attempt to exploit charitable institutions for their own social climbing. Do not apologize, Doctor, I replied, standing up and smoothing the front of my blazer. It is always better to excise a tumor before it has the chance to spread. Now, if you will excuse me, I have a gala to prepare for tomorrow night. I walked out of Chicago Memorial Hospital, the crisp afternoon air, a refreshing contrast to the sterile, panicked atmosphere I had just left behind in the boardroom. Ashley was dealt with. Her entire social standing was reduced to ash, her fraudulent academic history exposed to the very people she so desperately wanted to impress. Now it was time to watch the rest of the house of cards crumble. I slid into the back of my waiting car and directed my driver back to the Aegis Capital headquarters. Tomorrow night was Richard's Grand Oasis Fund Gala, and my so-called mother Diane was not going to miss the opportunity to drape herself in diamonds for the cameras. She needed to look the part of a triumphant billionaire's wife, a woman completely untouched by the rumors swirling around her family. Diane had booked a private VIP suite at a luxury couture boutique on Oak Street. I knew this because the boutique was owned by a high-end retail conglomerate that Aegis Capital had acquired the previous quarter. The store manager, a fiercely loyal woman who reported directly to my team, was keeping me updated with a live real-time feed of Diane's activities. My mother was currently sipping complimentary vintage champagne, while a team of stylists fawned over her presenting trays of imported silk gowns and velvet boxes filled with emeralds and diamonds. She was playing the role of the careless aristocrat, flawlessly demanding alterations and dismissing thousands of dollars of merchandise with a flick of her manicured wrist. I sat at my desk at Aegis, a secure tablet resting in my lap. As the majority stakeholder in the private bank that issued the Wilsons' primary credit lines, I had full visibility into their spending habits. More importantly, I had the ultimate authority to enforce their overdue margin calls. I watched the digital transaction ledger with calm, calculated patience. At precisely 3 o'clock, the first notification pinged on my screen. Diane was attempting to process a transaction for $85,000. It included a custom evening gown matching emerald drop earrings and a pair of exclusive designer heels. The system showed the request pending. I tapped a single highly encrypted button on my screen, enforcing a hard, irrevocable freeze on the account. Declined. My phone buzzed a moment later with a text from the boutique manager. Diane was waving her hand dismissively, telling the apologetic cashier to run the card again. She was loudly blaming the machine, laughing awkwardly, and claiming that the bank's fraud protection was overly sensitive regarding large, luxurious purchases. The cashier, following my strict instructions, swiped the card a second time. Declined. I could easily picture the exact shade of red creeping up Diane's neck. The casual, wealthy facade was slipping. She dug into her designer purse and pulled out her secondary card. This was Richard's corporate account, the one supposedly backed by the millions he no longer possessed, the one he claimed was newly infused with Dubai investor cash. She handed it to the cashier with a tight, strained smile. Declined. My tablet lit up with a rapid, frantic succession of denied transactions. Diane tried an American Express Platinum card. Declined. She tried a Visa Black card. Declined. She attempted to use a joint checking debit card. Insufficient funds. The digital ledgers on my screen were bleeding red. Every single line of credit, every hidden reserve, and every joint account tied to Richard and Diane Wilson was completely paralyzed. Diane was out of options, out of money, and currently standing in a high-end boutique with an audience of stylists watching her fail to purchase the clothes she had just spent 3 hours demanding. The grand illusion of the Wilson family wealth was evaporating in real time. Desperate, humiliated, and panicking, Diane made a phone call. She did not call Richard. Richard was too busy preening for his fake Dubai investors to be bothered with a retail emergency. Instead, she called Devin. Devin was a senior vice president at a major investment bank. He managed vast amounts of wealth. He knew how the banking infrastructure worked, how to override automatic holds, clear security blocks, and force high-level transactions through the system. He was the family's designated financial fixer. I knew exactly what Devin would do because I had already set the trap waiting for him at his desk. My lead financial investigator, a former federal auditor I had hired specifically to dismantle Devin's corporate embezzlement schemes, sent me a secure message. Target has logged into his executive terminal. He is attempting a manual override on the Wilson accounts. Devin was sitting in his spacious corner office, his phone pressed tightly to his ear as Diane frantically demanded he fix the humiliating situation at the boutique. He confidently logged into his secure banking portal, ready to type in his executive authorization codes to force the $85,000 transaction through the network. He told Diane to relax, assuring her he would handle it. He hit enter. The screen did not show an approval. It froze entirely. A stark, bright red warning banner flashed across his monitor, locking out his keyboard. Executive access permanently revoked. Account frozen, pending SEC inquiry. Devin slammed his fist on his desk and tried his secondary login credentials. Denied. He attempted to access his own personal offshore accounts, the secret ledgers where he had been quietly siphoning client funds for the past 5 years. Denied. Panic seized his chest. His office phone rang. It was not Diane calling back to complain about the boutique. It was his bank's chief compliance officer. I watched the text updates roll in from my investigator. Devin was being officially informed that an anonymous whistleblower had submitted a massive, irrefutable cache of documents to the Securities and Exchange Commission and the FBI just 48 hours prior. The digital dossier contained every forged signature, every ghost account, and every illicit wire transfer Devin had illegally authorized during his entire tenure as a vice president. Devin dropped the phone, the plastic clattering loudly against his desk. The color completely drained from his face. He remembered the cryptic warning I had given him weeks ago. He remembered the quiet, calculated way I had looked at him when he arrogantly told me I was out of my league. The pieces slammed together in his mind with terrifying, absolute clarity. Madeline. I was the anonymous tip. I was the whistleblower who had compiled his financial crimes. I had not just locked him out of Diane's pathetic shopping spree, I had handed his entire life over to the federal government on a silver platter. My phone buzzed with a final, highly satisfying update. Federal agents had just walked into the main lobby of Devin's building. The audit had officially begun. I set my tablet down on my desk, a deep, genuine smile crossing my face. The supporting cast was utterly destroyed. Ashley was exposed, Diane was publicly bankrupted, and Devin was about to be walked out of his office in federal handcuffs. Everything was perfectly aligned. Tomorrow night, Richard would stand on a brightly lit stage in front of the entire city, blissfully unaware that he was stepping directly onto the gallows. The dust had barely settled on Devin's federal raid when my private line rang. The caller ID flashed Richard's name. I let the phone vibrate across the glass of my desk, watching it with detached amusement. I let it ring 4 times before answering. His voice was uncharacteristically tight, carrying a false, jovial tone that made my skin crawl. He demanded a family dinner, a reconciliation he called it. He requested my presence at L'Etoile, the most expensive Michelin-starred dining room in Chicago, claiming we needed to put the recent ugliness behind us before his monumental gala tomorrow night. I knew exactly what this was. The Oasis Fund was a phantom. Richard's accounts were hemorrhaging, and his imaginary international wire transfers were miraculously delayed. He was drowning and he needed a life raft. He needed a bridge loan. I arrived at L'Etoile precisely at 8 o'clock. The restaurant was a cathedral of culinary excess, entirely draped in crushed velvet and lit by cascading crystal chandeliers. The air smelled of white truffles and old money. Richard and Diane were already seated at a prominent elevated corner table, surveying the dining room like fading royalty. Diane looked pale and brittle, her eyes darting nervously around the room, clearly traumatized from her humiliating retail rejection hours earlier. Richard, however, was doubling down on his delusion. Before I even pulled my chair out, Richard flagged the head sommelier. He ordered 2 bottles of a rare vintage Bordeaux running close to $4,000 each, followed immediately by their most extensive beluga caviar service. He was wildly overcompensating, projecting an aura of immense, untouchable wealth to intimidate me into compliance. He wanted to remind me of my place. He wanted to remind me that he was the patriarch, the billionaire developer, and I was just the ungrateful daughter lucky enough to be invited to his table. For the next hour I sat silently while they gorged themselves. They treated the waitstaff with customary appalling disdain, snapping their fingers and demanding constant immediate service. They treated me exactly the same way. Diane sniped about my tailored blazer, calling it aggressively corporate, while Richard continuously checked his heavy gold watch, performing the role of the exceptionally busy tycoon. They did not ask about my life. They did not ask about Aegis Capital. They simply talked at me, weaving a frantic, desperate illusion of their impending success. Finally, the silver caviar platters were cleared away. Richard leaned heavily across the table, folding his hands over the pristine white tablecloth. He offered me a paternal, deeply condescending smile. Madeline Richard began, his voice dripping with faux affection. We have had our differences. You have made some very immature, aggressive moves lately. I understand you are lashing out, but you are still family, and family forgives. I did not speak. I simply raised a single eyebrow, taking a slow sip of sparkling water. I waited for the pitch. My Dubai investors are fully committed, Richard continued smoothly, though a bead of sweat appeared at his hairline. But due to some ridiculous, overzealous international banking regulations, the $4 million wire transfer is delayed until Monday morning. It is a minor administrative hiccup. However, I have vendors for tomorrow's gala who demand immediate clearance. I need you to co-sign a brief 48-hour bridge loan, just $1 million to smooth over the weekend logistics. It is a mere formality. A formality, I repeated, keeping my tone entirely flat and devoid of emotion. Exactly, Diane chimed in, her voice shrill and tight with suppressed panic. It is the absolute least you can do, Madeline, considering everything we provided for you. We gave you a roof over your head. We gave you our prestigious name. You owe us your compliance. I stared at them. They were asking me for $1 million while actively insulting me, drinking $10,000 worth of wine they absolutely could not afford. The sheer breathtaking arrogance of their manipulation was almost poetic. They genuinely believed I was the same terrified, guilt-ridden girl they had tormented for decades. I raised my hand, signaling the waiter. He hurried over immediately, presenting the thick leather check presenter to Richard. The bill was astronomical. Richard did not even glance at the itemized receipt. He simply pushed the leather folder across the table toward me. Since you are so eager to make amends and prove your loyalty, you can handle the dinner bill, Richard stated, issuing a smug, authoritative command. I did not argue. I reached into the inner pocket of my blazer and pulled out a heavy black metal credit card. I placed it directly on top of the receipt and handed the leather folder back to the waiter. Take your time running that, I told the waiter with a polite, measured nod. I stood up, smoothing the front of my jacket. Richard beamed clearly, believing he had successfully cowed me into submission. He thought the bridge loan was next. He thought he had asserted his dominance and won the evening. I will not be signing your bridge loan, Richard, I said, looking down at him with absolute glacial calm. And I will not be attending your little pageant tomorrow night. But I do have a final piece of advice for you. Richard's victorious smile vanished instantly. Excuse me. Do not be stupid, Madeline. You owe this family your loyalty. I owe you absolutely nothing, I replied, my voice dropping to a harsh, cutting whisper. I spoke with Arthur Sterling yesterday afternoon. All the color immediately drained from Richard's face. He froze his body, going completely rigid against the velvet upholstery of the booth. Diane let out a sharp, choked gasp, her hand flying to her mouth in sheer terror. I know the truth, Richard, I stated, leaning in so only they could hear the venom in my words. I know about the original partnership contract. I know how you manipulated the incorporation documents and the land deeds the moment my biological father died. You did not build an empire. You stole it from a dead man, and you spent 30 years trying to punish his daughter for simply existing. Richard tried to speak, but his jaw just worked soundlessly. The legendary booming voice of the great Chicago developer had completely abandoned him. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost. Enjoy the wine, I said softly. I turned and walked away, navigating the elegant dining room with perfectly measured steps. I reached the heavy mahogany exit doors just as the waiter returned to their table. I paused, glancing back over my shoulder to watch the grand finale. The waiter leaned down, his expression deeply apologetic but uncompromisingly firm. He set the black metal card back on the white tablecloth. I am terribly sorry, sir, the waiter announced, his voice carrying clearly in the hushed, opulent restaurant. This card has been completely declined. The bank issuer states the account is frozen due to severe delinquency. Richard stared at this card in absolute horror. It was not my card. It was his own corporate Aegis account card, the specific secondary card I had officially confiscated, and permanently deactivated through the bank that very afternoon. I had brought it solely for this exact moment. Run it again. Richard demanded, his voice cracking with sudden absolute terror as the reality of his situation crashed down upon him. There is a mistake. Do you know who I am? I have run it 3 times, sir, the waiter replied, stepping back as the imposing restaurant manager quickly approached the table. And we have already attempted to process the card Mrs. Wilson has on file. That was also declined. I must ask you for an alternative valid form of payment immediately. The bill is $10,400. Diane burst into loud, hysterical tears, burying her face in her hands. Richard frantically patted his suit pockets, searching for cash, searching for a hidden lifeline that no longer existed. The manager sternly signaled the front security desk, instructing them to contact the authorities regarding a massive theft of services. I pushed the heavy restaurant doors open and stepped out into the cool evening air. I did not need to watch the police arrive to escort the great Richard Wilson away in handcuffs. He was completely out of time, out of money, and completely out of lies. Richard avoided spending the night in a local holding cell by surrendering his vintage Patek Philippe watch and his diamond cufflinks directly to the restaurant manager. It was a humiliating, desperate exchange, bartering his personal jewelry, just to keep the police from placing him in handcuffs in front of the elite diners at L'Etoile. He dragged his sobbing wife out of the restaurant through the service exit, stripped of his dignity and completely devoid of funds. Yet 24 hours later, he stood at the grand entrance of the Palmer House Hotel ballroom, projecting the absolute illusion of a triumphant billionaire. The night of the Oasis Fund Gala had finally arrived. The historic ballroom was a breathtaking display of reckless, unfunded extravagance. Towering ice sculptures flanked the entrance, thousands of imported white orchids cascaded from the balconies, and waitstaff circulated with trays of vintage champagne. Richard had financed the entire evening on fraudulent credit, leveraging the promise of the incoming $4 million Dubai investment to secure the venue and the catering. He was gambling everything on this single night. He stood on the red carpet with his family, posing for the blinding flashbulbs of the local and national financial press. They were aggressively performing the role of the ultimate unified American success story. Diane stood rigidly by his side, draped in a breathtaking Carolina Herrera evening gown. The dress was technically stolen. After her credit cards were universally declined yesterday, she had manipulated a junior boutique assistant into letting her take the gown on approval, secretly intending to return it the moment the gala concluded. Her smile was incredibly tight, her eyes constantly darting toward the entrance, terrified that a debt collector might walk through the doors. Ashley was doing her best to look haughty and untouchable, but her face was visibly swollen. She wore oversized dark designer sunglasses indoors, a desperate attempt to hide the physical evidence of her crying fit after being ruthlessly exposed at the hospital board meeting. She clung to her husband's arm, utterly dependent on his presence to maintain her shattered social armor. But Devin was in no condition to support anyone. He looked like a man walking to his own execution. Devin was sweating profusely, the moisture soaking through the collar of his custom-tailored tuxedo. His hands shook so violently that he had to shove them deep into his trouser pockets to hide the tremors. While Richard boasted to the cameras about international synergies and secured legacies, Devin kept his head down, frantically checking his encrypted mobile phone. The rumors were no longer just whispers in the executive washroom. They were actionable, terrifying reality. His defense attorney had sent him a frantic coded text message just 10 minutes before they arrived at the hotel. Federal agents from the Securities and Exchange Commission were currently executing a no-knock search warrant at his investment bank. They were seizing his physical hard drives, freezing his offshore routing numbers, and interviewing his junior associates. Devin knew with absolute gut-wrenching certainty that Madeline had provided the FBI with a flawless, undeniable map of his embezzlement. He was standing on a red carpet smiling for cameras while his entire freedom evaporated. "Mr. Wilson!" A reporter shouted over the din of the crowd, thrusting a microphone toward Richard. "Can you confirm the exact timeline for the Oasis Fund capital injection? Will the construction on the Richard Center resume by Monday morning?" Richard puffed out his chest, adjusting his silk tie with a practiced, arrogant flourish. "The capital is entirely secured," Richard declared, his voice booming with false authority. "The Oasis Fund representatives are arriving tonight to formally sign the final authorizations on stage. This partnership proves that true visionaries attract global smart money. We are completely immune to the petty amateur sabotage attempted by jealous local competitors. My legacy is absolute. Legacy." Devon squeezed his eyes shut, wishing the marble floor would simply open up and swallow him whole. He knew Aegis Capital was not an amateur firm. He knew Madeline was not a jealous competitor. She was an apex predator, and Richard was blindly walking right into her jaws. Richard had taken one final paranoid precaution for the evening. He had hired a team of private ex-military security contractors to guard the perimeter of the Palmer House Hotel. He handed the head of security a printed photograph of me issuing strict, non-negotiable orders. Under no circumstances was Madeline Vance allowed within 50 feet of the ballroom doors. He wanted to ensure his moment of glory remained completely uncontested. The rhythmic flash of the paparazzi cameras suddenly fractured. The photographers lowered their lenses, their attention collectively shifting away from Richard and toward the bustling street outside the hotel entrance. A fleet of 4 identical sleek black Cadillac Escalades glided smoothly to the curb, effectively blocking the main drop-off lane. The sheer coordinated presence of the vehicles commanded instant silence from the gathered crowd. The doors of the SUVs opened in perfect unison. A dozen elite corporate litigators stepped out onto the pavement. They wore sharp, tailored suits carrying heavy leather briefcases. They moved with a synchronized predatory grace, immediately forming a protective corridor leading directly to the red carpet. I stepped out of the lead vehicle. I wore a structured emerald green Tom Ford suit that caught the ambient light of the flashing cameras. I did not look at the press. I did not look at the grand architecture of the hotel. I locked my eyes directly onto Richard, who was standing at the top of the marble stairs. The color instantly vanished from Richard's face. He stumbled backward, knocking into Diane and nearly sending her sprawling into a floral arrangement. Panic, raw and unfiltered, warped his features. He frantically waved his hand at his security detail, pointing a trembling finger in my direction. "Stop her!" Richard screamed, his voice cracking horribly in front of the bewildered reporters. "I gave you strict orders. Remove her from the premises immediately." The head of security, a massive man with a tactical earpiece, stepped squarely into the center of the red carpet. He raised a heavy, commanding hand, physically blocking my path to the stairs. Ms. Vance, the security chief, said, his voice a low, warning rumble. "You are explicitly barred from this event. I am going to have to ask you to turn around and return to your vehicle." I did not break my stride. I did not even look at the security guard. I simply kept walking toward the marble steps. My lead corporate counsel, Arthur Sterling, stepped smoothly ahead of me. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a heavy platinum-embossed credential lanyard. He did not hand it over aggressively. He simply held it up so the security chief could read the raised lettering. The security chief narrowed his eyes, reading the credential. His tough, intimidating posture instantly dissolved. He looked up at Richard, who was practically hyperventilating at the top of the stairs, and then looked back down at the platinum pass. Without a single word of protest, the massive security guard stepped backward, clearing the path and bowing his head slightly in deference. Richard grabbed the brass railing of the stairs, his knuckles turning white. "What are you doing?" Richard shrieked at his guard. "I am paying you to keep her out." "Arthur." Sterling looked up at my panicking, sweating stepfather and offered a cold, devastating smile. "You are not paying him anything," Richard Arthur stated, his voice carrying effortlessly over the dead silent crowd. "Aegis Capital cleared his security invoice an hour ago, and Ms. Vance is not a guest you can turn away. She is listed on your schedule as the keynote speaker. She is the sole proprietor of the Oasis Fund." The blinding explosions of the paparazzi cameras illuminated the absolute terror paralyzing Richard's face. Arthur Sterling's declaration echoed across the red carpet, a heavy, irrefutable truth that shattered the carefully curated illusion of the Wilson family empire. But Richard was a man who had survived for 30 years on sheer sociopathic denial. His ego physically could not process the information. He instantly categorized Arthur's statement as a ruthless corporate stunt, a hostile tactic designed by Aegis Capital to steal his press coverage and humiliate him. He still genuinely believed his phantom investors from Dubai were landing at an exclusive private airstrip. Trapped in the glare of the flashing bulbs, Richard had to pivot. He could not drag me off the property screaming. He forced a booming, entirely artificial laugh that sounded like grinding glass. He stepped forward, spreading his arms wide in a grand theatrical gesture of welcome. Aegis Capital always knows how to make an entrance, Richard shouted for the benefit of the press, his voice entirely too loud. A surprise visit from my brilliant stepdaughter to celebrate our success. He marched down the steps and grabbed my arm. His fingers dug viciously into the fabric of my emerald suit, his grip tight enough to bruise. He pulled me toward the massive oak doors of the Palmer house, hauling me out of the camera flashes. Diane scrambled after us, looking completely faint, her stolen Carolina Herrera gown dragging heavily across the marble. Devon and Ashley trailed behind like prisoners of war, their heads bowed, completely broken by the federal raid currently dismantling their lives. Once we crossed the threshold into the grand foyer away from the reporters, Richard dropped my arm as if I had burned him. He leaned in his face inches from mine, his breath sour with panic and stale champagne. "You think you can hijack my press coverage with this pathetic stunt?" Richard hissed, his eyes wide and manic. "You think buying out my security detail makes you a player? You are nothing. You are a little girl playing with banking codes. Get inside, smile for the donors, and keep your mouth shut." I simply adjusted my cuffs, offering him a serene, pitying smile. I stepped past him and walked directly into the ballroom. The Palmer House Ballroom was a breathtaking monument to unfunded extravagance. Towering, intricately carved ice sculptures were already beginning to melt near the buffet stations. Thousands of imported white orchids cascaded from the vaulted balconies, perfuming the air with a heavy, cloying sweetness. The elite of Chicago high society mingled in their finest couture, sipping vintage champagne paid for with imaginary money. It was a beautiful, tragic shipwreck, and I had the best seat in the house. I took my position near the front of the stage, flanked seamlessly by Arthur Sterling and my legal team. 10 minutes later, the orchestra played a sweeping, triumphant fanfare. The crowd quieted, turning their attention to the brightly lit stage. Richard marched up the stairs to the podium. He adjusted the microphone, basking in the warm glow of the spotlight. He launched into his classic narcissistic monologue. He spoke about building Chicago, about preserving legacy, about the unmatched integrity of the Wilson family name. He projected the aura of a financial titan, a man completely untouched by the economic gravity holding down regular people. He gestured grandly toward where I was standing. "We are even graced tonight by my stepdaughter, Madeline Vance of Aegis Capital, who has come to witness the future of our enterprise," Richard announced, his voice dripping with condescending benevolence. "Please, Madeline, join me on stage." He was trying to cage me, attempting to force me to stand as a silent, compliant prop in his grand play. I walked calmly up the stairs, my heels clicking sharply against the polished wood. As I approached the podium, Richard pulled me into a rigid, highly staged embrace for the audience. He leaned his head down, pressing his lips near my ear. "Play along or I will ruin you," Richard whispered, his voice a razor-thin line of pure malice. "I will bury Aegis in litigation for a decade. Smile and step back." I pulled away from him, keeping my expression perfectly neutral, and took a deliberate step back from the podium. Richard turned his attention back to the eager, wealthy crowd, his chest puffed out with arrogant pride. It was time for his grand finale. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard boomed, his voice vibrating through the massive speakers. "Tonight is about global synergy. It is about recognizing that true vision attracts international power. I ask you all to direct your attention to the main doors at the back of the ballroom." The heavy spotlights immediately swung away from the stage, cutting through the dim room to illuminate the towering oak doors. The attendees craned their necks, murmuring with anticipation. "Please join me in welcoming our new partners, the managing directors and sovereign wealth representatives of the Oasis Fund," Richard shouted, raising his hands in triumph. The orchestra swelled, playing a loud, welcoming march. The crowd stared at the doors. Nothing happened. The doors remained completely stubbornly shut. The music played on for another 30 seconds before awkwardly tapering off into silence. Richard's triumphant smile faltered. A bead of sweat dripped down the side of his face. He chuckled nervously, tapping the side of the podium. Traffic from O'Hare Airport can be incredibly unforgiving, Richard joked, though his voice pitched noticeably higher with sudden gripping panic. Let us try that again. Ladies and gentlemen, the Oasis Fund. He pointed aggressively at the back of the room. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating quiet, broken only by the nervous clinking of a single ice cube in a glass somewhere near the front row. The wealthy elite of Chicago simply stared at the empty doorway, and then turned back to stare at Richard. He was unraveling in real time. His hands gripped the edges of the podium so hard his knuckles turned stark white. He looked wildly around the room, desperately searching for the billionaires who were supposed to save him from federal prison. I stepped forward. I moved directly in front of Richard, completely blocking him from the audience. I reached out and pulled the microphone toward me. I tapped the metal grill once. The sharp, percussive sound echoed like a gunshot through the dead, silent ballroom. There is no billionaire from Dubai, Richard. I stated, my voice ringing out with crystal-clear, devastating authority. You are looking at the sole owner of the Oasis Fund. Richard let out a loud, barking laugh that echoed uncomfortably against the vaulted ceilings. It was a harsh scraping sound, completely devoid of actual humor. He gripped the edges of the podium, his knuckles stark white against the dark wood, and scanned the faces of the city's elite. She is prone to these theatrical outbursts, Richard announced to the crowd, his voice straining to maintain its usual booming resonance. My stepdaughter has always possessed an overactive imagination. Madeline, this is not the time or the place for one of your manic episodes. You are embarrassing yourself, and you are embarrassing this family. I must ask security to kindly escort this delusional young woman off the stage so we can proceed with the actual business at hand. He waved his hand dismissively in my direction, but none of the security guards moved a single muscle. Arthur Sterling stood at the base of the stairs, arms crossed, his gaze fixed on Richard with absolute predatory calm. The audience remained perfectly still, captivated by the unfolding disaster. The quiet in the room was absolute, the clinking of champagne flutes completely ceasing as hundreds of wealthy investors waited for the next move. I did not blink. I reached into my pocket and retrieved a small, sleek remote control. I raised it so Richard could see it clearly and pressed a single button. Instantly, the massive digital screens flanking the stage flickered to life. The beautifully animated, spinning golden logos of the Oasis Fund vanished. In their place, a stark, high-resolution flowchart appeared. It was a complete, unredacted map of international corporate structuring. Let us trace the money, Richard Y. said, my voice projecting effortlessly across the ballroom. The screens zoomed in on the foundational documents of the Oasis Fund. The crowd watched as thick, red digital lines connected the supposedly independent Dubai Investment Group to a series of offshore holding companies in the Cayman Islands. From there, the lines traced directly back to American soil, terminating in a single glaringly obvious parent corporation. Aegis Capital. I am the sole proprietor of Aegis Capital. I continued, pacing slowly across the front of the stage. The Oasis Fund is nothing but a legally binding shell corporation I created 6 months ago. I established it the exact same week I discovered you had stolen my biological father's original partnership contracts. I built the Oasis Fund specifically to lure you in, Richard. I knew you were drowning in debt. I knew you were desperate for a lifeline. And I knew your monumental arrogance would blind you to basic due diligence. You never vetted the investors because you were too busy worshipping your own reflection. The ballroom erupted in a flurry of shocked whispers. Wealthy socialites and seasoned investors alike stared at the undeniable proof displayed on the 50-foot screens. The signatures, the routing numbers, the corporate seals. Everything was perfectly legal, perfectly documented, and completely damning. Richard spun around, staring at the glowing screens. His jaw worked frantically, but no words came out. The blood rushed from his face, leaving him looking sickly and hollow. The heavy layer of sweat on his forehead practically glowed under the stage lights. He staggered back from the podium, his eyes darting toward the exits. He finally understood the absolute totality of his ruin. Diane let out a sharp, hysterical sob from the side of the stage. She took a step toward her husband, her stolen designer gown tangling around her ankles, but a sharp look from Arthur Sterling froze her in place. "You set me up!" Richard gasped, his voice barely a wheeze. "This is illegal! This is corporate sabotage! You cannot do this to me!" "It is completely legal," I corrected him, my tone dropping to a sharp conversational cadence. "You signed the binding contracts of your own free will. You leveraged every single remaining asset you possessed against a phantom investment. You practically begged to hand me the keys to your entire empire. But that is not even the best part." I took another step toward him, forcing the great Chicago billionaire to retreat further until his back hit the rigid display board behind the podium. "Do you remember your birthday dinner last week?" I asked, watching his eyes widen in fresh, unadulterated terror. "Do you remember the gift I brought you? The envelope you threw back in my face? You ripped those papers in half without even bothering to read the header. You assumed it was a pathetic begging plea for funding. You told me I was weak and dismissed me in front of your entire family." Richard swallowed hard, his throat clicking audibly into the live microphone. "That document was not a funding request," Richard stated, enunciating every syllable with devastating precision. "It was a formal waiver of foreclosure. When you defaulted on your primary commercial loans last month, Aegis Capital purchased your toxic debt. We became your primary creditor overnight. That document I handed you was a legally binding offer to extend your grace period and temporarily pause the asset seizure process. It was your one and only lifeline." The entire ballroom held its collective breath. The silence was so heavy it felt pressurized. "By tearing up that document, you officially rejected the extension," I explained, looking down at my platinum wristwatch. "The standard legal grace period for a commercial default of this magnitude is exactly 7 days. I did the math, Richard. Because you destroyed that waiver to stroke your own ego, the 7-day grace period expired exactly 3 minutes ago." Richard fell to his knees. His legs simply gave out beneath the weight of his absolute destruction. The grand, untouchable patriarch was reduced to a shaking, weeping shell on the stage of his own fake gala. He reached a trembling hand out toward me, his face twisted in a mask of pure agony. "Madeline, please!" Richard begged, his voice cracking into a high, pathetic whine. "Please, I will give you anything. I will publicly apologize. I will make it right. Do not take my company. Do not take my name." "Your name means nothing to me," I replied, staring down at him with glacial indifference. "And your company already belongs to me." A sudden deafening crash echoed from the back of the ballroom. The heavy, ornate oak doors were violently thrown open, slamming against the marble walls with bone-jarring force. The crowd gasped and parted instinctively, rushing to clear a wide path down the center aisle. A small army of men and women in dark windbreakers and tactical gear marched purposefully into the venue. The bold yellow letters on their jackets spelled out FBI and SEC. Flanking them were half a dozen uniformed local sheriffs, their hands resting firmly on their duty belts. Richard let out a loud barking laugh that echoed uncomfortably against the hotel's vaulted ceilings. It was a harsh, scraping sound completely devoid of actual humor. He gripped the heavy brass railing of the marble stairs, his knuckles stark white, and scanned the faces of the bewildered press corps. "She is prone to these theatrical outbursts," Richard announced to the crowd, his voice straining to maintain its usual booming resonance. "My stepdaughter has always possessed an overactive imagination, Madeline. This is not the time or the place for one of your manic episodes. You are embarrassing yourself, and you are embarrassing this family." He waved his hand aggressively at his security detail, silently demanding they physically remove me from the premises. Not a single guard moved a muscle. They stood perfectly still, their hands clasped in front of them, deferring entirely to Aegis Capital. The silence on the red carpet was absolute, the rapid-fire clicking of camera shutters having completely ceased as the reporters waited for the next move. I did not blink. I reached into my clutch and retrieved a sleek black remote control. I raised it so Richard could see it clearly and pressed a single button, E. Instantly, the massive digital screens erected inside the ballroom, clearly visible through the open grand doors, flickered to life. The beautifully animated spinning golden logos of the Oasis Fund vanished. In their place, a stark high-resolution flowchart appeared. It was a complete, unredacted map of international corporate structuring. "Let us trace the money," Richard Weiss said, my voice carrying cleanly over the silent crowd. The screen zoomed in on the foundational documents of the Oasis Fund. The guests inside the ballroom turned to watch as thick red digital lines connected the supposedly independent Dubai Investment Group to a series of offshore holding companies in the Cayman Islands. From there, the lines traced directly back to American soil, terminating in a single glaringly obvious parent corporation, Aegis Capital. "I am the sole proprietor of Aegis Capital." I continued walking slowly up the marble stairs until I stood on the exact same step as my panicking stepfather. "The Oasis Fund is nothing but a legally binding shell corporation I created 6 months ago. I established it the exact same week I discovered you had stolen my biological father's original partnership contracts. I built the Oasis Fund specifically to lure you in, Richard. I knew you were drowning in debt. I knew you were desperate for a lifeline. And I knew your monumental arrogance would blind you to basic due diligence. You never vetted the investors because you were too busy worshipping your own reflection." The reporters erupted, shouting questions and shoving recorders forward. The wealthy socialites inside the ballroom stared at the undeniable proof displayed on the massive screens. The signatures, the routing numbers, the corporate seals. Everything was perfectly legal, perfectly documented, and completely damning. Richard spun around, staring at the glowing screens visible through the lobby. His jaw worked frantically, but no words came out. The blood rushed from his face, leaving him looking sickly and hollow. The heavy layer of sweat on his forehead practically glowed under the ambient light. He staggered backward, his eyes darting wildly around the entrance. He finally understood the absolute totality of his ruin. "You set me up!" Richard gasped, his voice barely a wheeze. "This is illegal. This is corporate sabotage. You cannot do this to me." "It is completely legal," I corrected him, my tone dropping to a sharp conversational cadence. "You signed the binding contracts of your own free will. You leveraged every single remaining asset you possessed against a phantom investment. You practically begged to hand me the keys to your entire empire. But that is not even the best part." I took another step toward him, forcing the great Chicago billionaire to retreat further. "Do you remember your birthday dinner last week?" I asked, watching his eyes widen in fresh, unadulterated terror. "Do you remember the gift I brought you? The envelope you threw back in my face? You ripped those papers in half without even bothering to read the header. You assumed it was a pathetic begging plea for funding. You told me I was weak and dismissed me in front of your entire family." Richard swallowed hard, his throat clicking audibly. "That document was not a funding request," Richard DeFree stated, enunciating every syllable with devastating precision. "It was a formal waiver of foreclosure. When you defaulted on your primary commercial loans last month, Aegis Capital purchased your toxic debt. We became your primary creditor overnight. That document I handed you was a legally binding offer to extend your grace period and temporarily pause the asset seizure process. It was your one and only lifeline." The entire crowd held its collective breath. The silence was so heavy it felt pressurized. "By tearing up that document, you officially rejected the extension," I explained, looking down at my platinum wristwatch. "The standard legal grace period for a commercial default of this magnitude is exactly 7 days. I did the math, Richard. Because you destroyed that waiver to stroke your own ego, the 7-day grace period expired exactly 3 minutes ago." Richard fell to his knees. His legs simply gave out beneath the weight of his absolute destruction. The grand, untouchable patriarch was reduced to a shaking, weeping shell on the red carpet. He reached a trembling hand out toward me, his face twisted in a mask of pure agony. A sudden, deafening crash echoed from the main street. The crowd gasped and parted instinctively, rushing to clear a wide path. A small army of men and women in dark windbreakers and tactical gear marched purposefully onto the property. The bold yellow letters on their jackets spelled out FBI and SEC. Flanking them were half a dozen uniformed local sheriffs, their hands resting firmly on their duty belts. The moment the federal agents crossed the threshold, Devin realized his entire life was over. The SEC raid on his investment bank had not been a warning. It had been the final nail in his coffin, and these agents were here to collect the body. Panic, raw and electric, flooded Devin's veins. He dropped Ashley's arm. He did not say a single word to his wife. He simply turned and vanished into the dense thicket of terrified socialites inside the ballroom. His custom-tailored tuxedo, previously a symbol of his elite status, now felt like a suffocating straitjacket. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes and soaking his stiff collar. He shoved past a bewildered alderman and practically trampled a waiter carrying a tray of untouched caviar. His eyes were locked on a pair of discreet brass-handled swinging doors tucked behind a massive floral arrangement on the far left side of the room. The service exit. It led down a narrow corridor to the hotel kitchens, and from there to the loading dock and the alleyway. If he could just reach the alley, he could disappear into the Chicago night. He had a go bag in his office safe. He had offshore accounts that Madeline might not have found yet. He just needed to run. He reached the heavy doors and shoved his shoulder against the wood, bursting through into the dimly lit service corridor. He took exactly 2 steps toward freedom before a solid wall of dark fabric and Kevlar stopped him dead in his tracks. 2 massive FBI agents stepped out of the shadows. They did not draw their weapons, but their sheer physical presence was a lethal threat. The lead agent reached out and shoved a heavy hand directly into the center of Devin's chest. The force sent Devin stumbling backward, his polished leather shoes slipping on the linoleum floor. "You are going the wrong way, sir," the agent stated, his voice devoid of any emotion. "The party is back inside." Devin opened his mouth to argue, but his vocal cords refused to work. The second agent grabbed him by the shoulder, spinning him around with terrifying ease, and shoved him back through the swinging brass doors. Devin stumbled back into the blinding light of the ballroom, nearly falling to his knees. The crowd gasped, stepping away from him to form a wide, isolating circle. He was completely exposed, trapped in the center of the room. "Going somewhere, Devin?" I stood just inside the ballroom doors, holding a wireless microphone that had been handed to me by the sound technician. My voice amplified through the massive sound system, slicing through the panicked murmurs of the crowd. I watched him squirm like an insect pinned to a board. I gestured toward the tech team again. The massive digital screens shifted. The corporate flowchart mapping Richard's downfall vanished. In its place, a complex web of bank routing numbers, wire transfers, and forged invoices illuminated the room. The numbers were staggering. Millions of dollars, all highlighted in bold red text. While Richard Wilson was busy destroying his own company through sheer incompetence, his son-in-law was actively utilizing the wreckage for his own criminal enterprise, I announced to the audience. Richard's doomed construction project, the Richard Center, was nothing more than a giant concrete washing machine for Devin's investment bank. The crowd stared at the screens, their eyes widening as they read the damning evidence. Prominent investors who had entrusted their fortunes to Devin's firm began to shout in outrage. Devin stood frozen in the center of the circle, his chest heaving. He looked at me with a mixture of pure hatred and absolute defeat. For the past 2 years, Devin has been systematically embezzling funds from his most lucrative client portfolios. I continued, my voice echoing off the walls. He created fake invoices for non-existent construction materials, billed them to Richard's failing development company, and routed the payments directly into offshore shell accounts in the Cayman Islands. He used his own father-in-law's crumbling legacy to launder stolen money. He thought moving the capital through 3 different international borders would mask the trail. I paused, letting the silence amplify the weight of my next words. But Aegis Capital employs forensic accountants who hunt cartels for sport, Devin. You left a digital footprint a mile wide. We handed the complete unredacted ledger to the Securities and Exchange Commission 48 hours ago. Every fake invoice, every illegal wire transfer, every offshore routing number. They have it all. Your firm is currently being dismantled piece by piece, and your accounts have been frozen globally. You are entirely bankrupt. The FBI agents who had marched into the venue finally reached Devon. They did not read him his rights politely. The lead agent grabbed Devon's wrist, twisting his arm behind his back with practiced, brutal efficiency. The sharp metallic click of handcuffs snapping shut echoed clearly over the stunned silence. The sound shattered whatever remained of Devon's sanity. The slick, arrogant investment banker completely dissolved. He was physically restrained, humiliated in front of his peers, his clients, and the city's financial elite. He looked wildly around the room, his eyes bloodshot and frantic. His gaze finally locked onto Ashley. His wife was standing near the edge of the crowd, her hands clamped over her mouth, her face a mask of absolute horror. She was staring at the handcuffs biting into her husband's wrists, watching the source of her immense wealth and social power evaporate into thin air. Devon snapped. "This is your fault!" Devon screamed at the top of his lungs, his voice tearing through the ballroom like a jagged blade. He thrashed against the grip of the federal agent, spitting with rage as he glared at his wife. "You did this to me!" Ashley flinched, taking a terrified step backward as the crowd stared at her in shock. "You and your insatiable greed!" Devon roared, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. "You needed the penthouse. You needed the private flights. You demanded a billionaire lifestyle on a millionaire's salary. You never stopped taking. I had to steal just to keep up with your credit card bills. I am going to federal prison because you could not handle looking poor in front of your pathetic country club friends." Devon's brutal, agonizing confession echoed off the vaulted ceilings of the Palmer House ballroom. The silence that followed was absolute, suffocating, and dripping with high society schadenfreude. The city's elite, the very people Ashley had spent her entire adult life trying to impress, dominate, and belittle, were now staring at her with naked, unfiltered disgust. Ashley's face went completely ashen. The carefully applied layers of designer makeup could not hide the sheer panic pulling at the corners of her mouth. She looked at her husband struggling in the grip of federal agents, and then she looked at the circle of wealthy socialites whispering behind their hands. Her entire universe, built entirely on vanity and stolen credit, was collapsing in a spectacular public inferno. She could not attack the FBI, she could not attack the federal government, but her eyes darted across the red carpet and locked onto me. "You monster!" Ashley shrieked, the sound tearing from her throat like a feral animal. She lunged forward, her high heels snapping against the marble floor. She bypassed the federal agents and charged directly at the stage where I stood. Her hands were curled into claws, her manicured nails aiming straight for my face. She had completely lost whatever fragile grip she had left on her pristine country club sanity. "You did this! You ruined us!" Ashley screamed, her voice cracking as she swung her arm wildly. "You are a psychotic, jealous freak. We gave you a family and you destroyed us." Arthur Sterling smoothly stepped sideways, intending to intercept her, but I simply raised my hand, signaling him to stop. I did not flinch. I did not step back. As Ashley's hand came down, I reached out and caught her wrist in midair. My grip was unyielding, locking her arm in place before she could make contact. She thrashed against my hold, sobbing hysterically, but I pulled her slightly closer, forcing her to look directly into my eyes. "I did not destroy you, Ashley." I stated, my voice carrying a quiet, terrifying calm that forced her to stop struggling. "I just turned on the lights. You and your husband built a house out of matches and gasoline. You destroyed yourselves." I released her wrist, giving her a firm push backward. She stumbled, her heel catching on the hem of her silk gown, and fell hard onto the polished wood floor. She scrambled to her knees, weeping openly, her mascara running in thick black rivulets down her cheeks. "This is not fair," she sobbed, looking wildly at the crowd for any sign of sympathy. "We are the Wilsons. We belong here. These are our things." She defensively clutched the massive, breathtaking diamond necklace resting against her collarbone. It was a custom cascading collar of flawless white diamonds, a piece so obscenely expensive it caught the light from every chandelier in the ballroom. She had paraded it around all evening, flaunting it as proof of her absolute superiority. "Actually, Mrs. Blackwood, those are not your things." A sharp, heavily accented voice cut through the murmurs of the crowd. The guests parted to reveal a tall, impeccably dressed man stepping into the center circle. It was Henri Laurent, the owner of Chicago's most exclusive jewelry boutique. He was a man who catered exclusively to the ultra-wealthy, and he looked absolutely livid. He walked directly toward the federal agents holding Devin brandishing a digital tablet. "Agent Mr. Laurent," said his voice crisp and carrying perfectly through the quiet room. "My boutique facilitated the sale of that diamond necklace to Mr. Blackwood yesterday afternoon. The transaction was processed via a wire transfer from a Cayman Islands holding account, an account your agency froze early this morning." The wire bounced. "That necklace was acquired using fraudulent funds. It is stolen property." Ashley gasped, her hands flying up to cover the diamonds as if protecting a child. "No. No, Devin bought this for me. It is an anniversary present. It is mine." The lead FBI agent holding Devin nodded toward the two local county sheriffs standing by the ballroom doors. The sheriffs immediately unclipped their radios and marched across the floor, stopping directly in front of Ashley, who was still kneeling on the wood. "Ma'am, you need to remove the jewelry immediately," the taller sheriff commanded, his hand resting casually on his utility belt. "The funds used to purchase that item are part of an active federal embezzlement investigation. That makes the necklace evidence, and possessing it constitutes receiving stolen property. Take it off." Ashley scrambled backward, shaking her head frantically. She looked at Richard, but her father was still slumped against the stage podium, utterly paralyzed by his own financial ruin. She looked at Diane, but her mother had covered her face with her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. There was no one left to save her. "I am not taking it off," Ashley shrieked, pressing her back against a marble pillar. "I am a Wilson. You cannot treat me like a common criminal. I will sue your entire department." The sheriff did not blink. He simply reached to his belt and unclasped his heavy metal handcuffs, letting them swing freely from his fingers. The sharp metallic clinking sound echoed with terrifying clarity. "You have exactly 5 seconds to unhook that clasp, ma'am," the sheriff stated, his voice dropping into a dangerous, commanding register. "Or I will arrest you for possession of stolen property, place you in these cuffs, and process you in the back of the same transport van as your husband." 1, 2. Ashley let out a loud, agonizing wail. It was the sound of a woman having her very soul ripped from her body. Her entire identity, her superiority, her unearned arrogance was entirely dependent on the illusion of wealth. And now she was being publicly stripped of it. With trembling, manicured fingers, she reached behind her neck. She fumbled blindly with the intricate platinum clasp, her chest heaving with heavy, humiliating sobs. Finally, the locking mechanism clicked open. The heavy diamond collar slipped from her skin. She held it out, her hand shaking so violently the diamonds rattled against each other. The sheriff stepped forward, snapping on a pair of blue latex gloves. He took the necklace from her trembling hands and unceremoniously dropped the $500,000 piece of jewelry into a clear plastic evidence bag. Ashley remained kneeling on the floor, her neck bare, her designer gown suddenly looking like a cheap costume. The illusion was dead. The armor was gone. The crowd of socialites she had desperately tried to rule were actively taking photos of her humiliation with their smartphones. "All right, let's go," the FBI agent ordered, giving Devin a hard shove toward the main doors. Devin did not look back. He kept his head down, staring at the marble floor as the federal agents marched him through the grand lobby and out into the flashing red and blue lights of the waiting police cruisers. Ashley was left completely alone. She knelt in the exact center of the Palmer House ballroom, stripped of her fake jewels, stripped of her money, and stripped of her pride, weeping uncontrollably as the cold reality of her new life finally settled over her. The heavy oak doors swung shut, sealing Devin's fate, and leaving a ringing silence in their wake. Ashley's sobs were the only sound piercing the quiet of the grand ballroom. The Chicago elite, a crowd that thrived on exclusivity and decorum, stood entirely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the scandal unfolding before them. Then a piercing shriek shattered the tension. "Madeline!" Diane broke away from the shadows near the stage. The shock that had glued her to the spot finally snapped, replaced by a frantic, desperate rage. She hoisted the heavy skirts of her stolen Carolina Herrera gown and practically lunged toward the podium. Her meticulously styled hair had fallen loose, framing a face twisted in grotesque tear-streaked fury. She did not look at her weeping daughter on the floor. She did not look at her ruined husband slumped against the back wall. She aimed all her venom entirely at me. "You ungrateful, vicious little viper!" Diane screamed, her voice echoing harshly through the microphone I still held. She reached the bottom of the stage steps, pointing a trembling, accusatory finger at my chest. She was playing her favorite role, the ultimate long-suffering victim. "How could you do this to us?" Diane wailed, turning slightly to ensure the crowd could see her tears. "We took you in. We raised you when you had absolutely nothing. We put clothes on your back. We fed you. We gave you a family. And we gave you the Wilson name. We gave you everything. And you repay us by destroying my husband and ruining my daughter." The crowd murmured, the wealthy socialites inherently susceptible to a mother's desperate plea. Diane was banking on their sympathy, using the only weapon she had left, her manufactured martyrdom. She expected me to shrink, to apologize, to feel the crushing weight of the guilt she had spent 20 years instilling in me. I stood perfectly still, looking down at the woman who had traded my childhood for a country club membership. "You did not give me the Wilson name, Diane," I replied, my voice projecting coldly and clearly across the room. "You forced it on me to erase the only name that actually mattered." I raised my remote control and pressed the button one final time. The massive digital screens behind me flickered. Devon's incriminating financial records vanished, replaced by a high-resolution scan of a yellowing, decades-old legal document. The edges of the paper were frayed, but the bold black ink of the signatures at the bottom was unmistakable. The ballroom fell deadly silent as hundreds of eyes scanned the projected image. It was a corporate charter, a foundational partnership agreement for the very real estate empire Richard had just spent an hour boasting about. "Look closely at the screen, ladies and gentlemen," I instructed the crowd. "Look at the signatures. You will see Richard Wilson's name listed as a minority junior partner with a non-voting 10% share. Now look at the name of the majority stakeholder, the man holding 90% of the equity, the capital, and the original deeds to the land the Richard Center is currently sinking into." A collective gasp rippled through the front rows as the guests read the bold, undeniable print. The name on the contract was Arthur Vance, my biological father. Richard let out a strangled, animalistic groan from the corner of the stage. He tried to push himself up, trying to block the screen, but his legs failed him. "My father did not die bankrupt, as Richard has spent the last 2 decades claiming," I explained, my voice echoing with righteous, absolute certainty. "He died as the sole visionary and financial backer of this entire enterprise. When he passed away unexpectedly, he left everything in a trust meant for his only daughter. But Richard saw an opportunity. He saw a grieving widow and a vulnerable child, and he saw a mountain of prime Chicago real estate." I turned my gaze back to Diane, who was standing frozen at the bottom of the stairs. The fake tears had entirely dried up. Raw, naked fear had completely taken over her features. She looked like a ghost. "You did not marry him out of love, Diane," I stated, laying the ugly truth bare for the entire city to witness. "You married him because he promised you wealth, and he needed you to get it. By marrying my mother and legally adopting me, Richard gained conservatorship over my father's trust. He gained voting control over the Vance properties. He legally buried my father's legacy, rebranded the company under his own name, and spent 20 years draining my inheritance to fund your pathetic, hollow lifestyle." I stepped closer to the edge of the stage, looking down at my mother and my stepfather. "You didn't raise me out of kindness," I declared, every word striking like a hammer blow. "You didn't keep me in that house because you loved me. You kept me close so you could control the true heir to this land. You kept me under your thumb because you were terrified of what would happen the second I turned 18 and gained access to those sealed records. You treated me like a burden when I was the only reason you were not living on the street." Diane stumbled backward, shaking her head. She opened her mouth to deny it, to spin another lie, but there was nowhere left to hide. The signatures were projected 50 feet high. The proof was absolute. She looked around the room, begging for anyone to come to her defense. No one moved. The wealthy investors, the politicians, the elite socialites who had happily drank Richard's champagne all evening looked at the Wilson family with unfiltered revulsion. This was not just a story of bad investments or poor market timing. This was a story of profound, unforgivable theft. Richard had not just defrauded the banks. He had stolen a dead man's legacy and robbed a child to build his empire. In the ruthless world of high finance, failure could sometimes be forgiven, but stealing from your own partner and child was a cardinal sin. The atmosphere in the ballroom shifted instantly. The shock dissolved, replaced by a cold, calculating wave of self-preservation. A man in the front row, the CEO of a major logistics firm, pulled his smartphone from his tuxedo jacket. He did not bother stepping out into the hallway. He dialed his general counsel right there in the front row, his voice carrying clearly into the sudden quiet. "Kill the Wilson contracts." The CEO ordered his lawyer, not taking his eyes off Richard. "All of them. Terminate the supply lines immediately. I do not care about the penalty clauses. Get our name off his ledger tonight." It was the spark that ignited the powder keg. Suddenly, the entire ballroom erupted into motion. A symphony of rustling fabric and clicking phone screens echoed through the massive space. Dozens of investors, contractors, and silent partners began pulling out their phones simultaneously. Men and women in designer evening wear turned their backs on the stage, frantically typing messages, placing urgent calls to their legal teams, and severing every remaining tie they had to the Wilson family. Cancel the cement order. Freeze their escrow account. Pull our pending applications from their board. The voices overlapped, creating a chaotic chorus of absolute financial destruction. They were abandoning the sinking ship, treating Richard like toxic waste. They were not just cutting ties, they were actively protecting their own assets from the radioactive fallout of the SEC investigation and the monumental fraud I had just exposed. Richard watched his entire empire dissolve in real time. He saw men he had played golf with for 20 years actively canceling millions of dollars in contracts. He saw the very foundation of his life crumbling into dust. He clawed at his chest, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps, as the sheer panic finally overloaded his system. His knees hit the hardwood stage with a sickening thud. The sound reverberated through the microphone I still held. It was a dull, heavy thump that marked the exact moment the great Richard Wilson ceased to exist in the world of high finance. His $4 million dream project was officially dead. His immaculate, carefully curated reputation as a titan of industry was completely eradicated. With federal agents processing his son-in-law just outside the ballroom doors, and the Securities and Exchange Commission actively tearing through his offshore corporate structures, his freedom was officially forfeit. He looked up at me from the floor, his face utterly devoid of the arrogant sneer he had worn my entire life. "Madeline, please," Richard gasped, his voice trembling so violently he could barely form the words. "You cannot do this. You have made your point. You have the upper hand. Just stop the projection. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. I will give you whatever you want. I will transfer the commercial deeds back to your name. I will make you a full equal partner in everything. Just please, I am begging you, do not send me to prison. I am an old man. I will not survive a federal indictment." He actually reached out and grabbed the hem of my designer gown, his sweaty fingers clutching the silk like a drowning man grabbing a life preserver. I stepped back, instantly repulsed by the contact, forcing him to let go. "There are no partnerships left to offer, Richard," I stated, staring down at his pathetic, shivering form with absolute detachment. "Your firm is completely bankrupt. Your assets are permanently frozen. The financial evidence of your generational fraud is currently being processed by the authorities as we speak." I made sure the federal investigators received every single piece of undeniable evidence. In fact, the SEC is actively reviewing a file you can reference named Duyen Mao 1_24.docx, which contains the original forged deeds you used to usurp my father. They also possess a file you can reference named Duyen Mao 2_24.docx, detailing your illegal offshore wire transfers, along with a file you can reference named Duyan Mao 3_24.docx, and a file you can reference named Duyan Mao 4_24.docx, which thoroughly outline the dummy accounts you used to hide my father's stolen money. You left a digital paper trail a mile wide, and Aegis Capital simply gathered the breadcrumbs. Hearing the absolute terrifying finality in my voice, Diane threw herself across the stage. She fell beside her ruined husband, her stolen Carolina Herrera dress bunching up awkwardly around her knees. The fierce, venomous anger she had displayed just moments ago evaporated entirely. It was instantly replaced by the desperate, clinging manipulation she had weaponized throughout my entire childhood. "Maddie, listen to me," Diane sobbed, clasping her heavily jeweled hands together in a theatrical prayer. "He made a mistake. We all make mistakes in life, but we are family. Blood is thicker than money. You cannot destroy your own flesh and blood like this in front of all these people. The Bible teaches us about Christian forgiveness, Madeline. It teaches us to turn the other cheek and offer grace to those who have wronged us. You have a good heart. You always had such a gentle, sweet, forgiving heart. Please show us some mercy. Do not leave your own mother with absolutely nothing." I looked down at the woman who had given birth to me. I looked at the woman who had happily watched her new husband systematically strip my biological father of his hard-earned legacy. I looked at the mother who had stood by silently while I was verbally abused, financially starved, and ultimately thrown out of my own childhood home into the freezing Chicago winter. My expression remained completely ice-cold. I did not feel a single shred of pity. I did not feel an ounce of the guilt she was so desperately trying to trigger. "Christian forgiveness requires genuine repentance, Diane," I replied, my voice carrying clearly over the silent ballroom, slicing through the heavy pressurized air. "You are not sorry for what you did to me. You are not sorry for stealing my father's land. You are only sorry that you finally got caught by the daughter you underestimated." I crouched down slightly so I was directly eye level with both of them. "Do you remember the night you kicked me out?" I asked, my tone dangerously quiet, but amplified perfectly through the sound system for every investor to hear. "Do you remember what you said to me as I stood on the porch with a single garbage bag full of my clothes? You mocked me. You laughed in my face while Richard locked the deadbolt. You told me I was a failure and a parasite. You said I wasn't your daughter and you threw me out like trash." Diane flinched as if she had been physically struck, fresh panicked tears spilling over her heavily powdered cheeks. She reached out a shaking hand, her lips trembling, but I stood up gracefully before she could make contact. "You were right, Diane," I declared, squaring my shoulders and raising my voice so the investors in the very back row could hear every single syllable of their destruction. "I am not your daughter. I am your landlord, and you are evicted." I turned my back on their sobbing broken forms and walked directly to the center of the stage. Arthur Sterling stepped forward from the wings, his face perfectly stoic, his posture radiating quiet power. He handed me a sleek digital tablet and a silver stylus. The massive screens behind me shifted one final time, mirroring exactly what was displayed on the tablet in my hands. It was the master writ of foreclosure. It was the binding, irrefutable legal document that officially seized the Wilson estate, their luxury vehicles, their company headquarters, and their personal bank accounts to immediately cover their defaulted toxic debt. The crowd of Chicago elite watched in breathless, captivated silence as I raised the stylus. I did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. I pressed the pen to the glowing screen and signed my name with a swift, decisive flourish. My signature appeared instantly on the 50-foot projection behind me in bright, glowing digital ink. The tablet chimed a sharp, validating tone that signaled the immediate, irreversible execution of the contract. The transfer of wealth was permanently complete. The gavel had officially fallen on the Wilson empire. The morning sun offered no warmth to the sprawling Wilson estate in Lake Forest. The meticulously manicured lawns and towering oak trees, usually symbols of generational wealth and untouchable status, now felt like the walls of a beautifully landscaped prison. At exactly 7 o'clock, The heavy silence of the exclusive neighborhood was shattered by the crunch of thick tires on the gravel driveway. 4 black and white Cook County Sheriff cruisers pulled up to the grand entrance, their light bars flashing in a rhythmic, blinding warning against the pristine white columns of the mansion. The lead deputy marched up the sweeping brick steps and hammered his fist against the custom mahogany double doors. The sound echoed through the quiet cul-de-sac, drawing the attention of wealthy neighbors who began parting their silk curtains to watch the spectacle unfold. Inside, the heavy deadbolt clicked, and the door swung open to reveal Richard. He was still wearing the trousers and wrinkled dress shirt from the gala the night before. His face was completely gray, his eyes sunken and bloodshot from a sleepless night spent desperately dialing lawyers who refused to answer his calls. By order of the county court, this property has been foreclosed and transferred to Aegis Capital, the deputy announced, holding up a heavy clipboard. You have exactly 30 minutes to vacate the premises. You are permitted to take only basic personal clothing and essential toiletries. All furniture, art, jewelry, and electronics remain with the estate. Richard tried to speak, but his voice was completely gone. He stepped aside, physically defeated, as a team of armed deputies and private auditors streamed past him into the grand foyer. From the top of the sweeping marble staircase, Diane let out a piercing shriek. She scrambled down the steps, her hair completely undone, clutching an armful of mink coats and designer purses. You cannot do this, Diane screamed, stepping in front of a deputy who was methodically taping a bright yellow inventory tag to a massive crystal vase. This is my home. These are my things. I need boxes. I need to call my personal movers. The deputy did not even look at her. He simply pulled a roll of thick black industrial trash bags from his duty belt and tossed them onto the imported Persian rug at her feet. You have 28 minutes left, ma'am, he stated flatly. Fill the bags or leave empty-handed. Diane dropped to her knees, clutching the cheap plastic bags. The ultimate matriarch of Chicago high society, a woman who had spent decades organizing charity galas and looking down her nose at anyone who wore off-the-rack clothing, was now frantically shoving her crushed silk blouses and cashmere sweaters into garbage bags. She wept openly, her manicured nails tearing the plastic as she tried to cram a heavy velvet gown inside. Richard simply stood by the front door, staring blankly at the wall, completely catatonic, as strangers catalogued his ruin. Outside, the situation was even more pathetic. Ashley sat on the edge of the cold concrete curb at the end of the driveway. She was still wearing the ruined designer gown from the night before, the expensive fabric stained with tears and dirt. When Devin was hauled off by the FBI, federal agents immediately descended upon their downtown penthouse. Every bank account bearing her name had been frozen by midnight. Her platinum credit cards were declined when she tried to check into a hotel. She had nowhere to go, no friends willing to answer a phone call from the wife of an indicted embezzler, and absolutely no access to cash. She hugged her knees to her chest, rocking back and forth as she watched the deputies carry out black trash bags filled with her parents' belongings. A few neighbors had walked out to the end of their driveways, holding their morning coffees, openly staring at her humiliation. The golden child, the perfect daughter, who had spent her entire life stepping on my neck to elevate herself, was now a public spectacle of absolute destitution. The low, powerful purr of a V12 engine broke the morning quiet. A pristine midnight black Maybach glided smoothly down the street, parting the line of parked police cruisers with effortless grace. The vehicle pulled to a gentle stop precisely at the end of the driveway, right in front of Ashley. I sat in the back seat, dressed in a sharp, tailored charcoal business suit, holding a steaming cup of coffee. I did not step out of the car. I did not need to stand on their lawn to feel the absolute totality of my victory. Gloating was for amateurs, and I was running an empire. The tinted rear window rolled down with a soft mechanical hum. Ashley looked up from the curb, her face twisted in a mixture of hatred and desperate begging hope. Diane and Richard emerged from the front doors, each dragging a black trash bag across the gravel, freezing when they saw the car. The lead sheriff walked over to my window. I calmly picked up a thick leather-bound manila folder resting on the seat beside me. It contained the finalized court-stamped execution of foreclosure. "Good morning, Deputy," I said, handing the folder through the window. "Here is the final paperwork. authorizing the total seizure of the estate. Please ensure the locks are changed by noon. Aegis Capital will be sending a private security team to secure the perimeter. Understood, ma'am. The sheriff nodded, taking the folder. I turned my gaze toward the driveway. I looked at Ashley weeping on the curb. I looked at Diane clutching a garbage bag. I looked at Richard, a hollow shell of the tyrant he used to be. I did not smile. I did not say a single word to them. My silence was heavier and far more devastating than any insult I could have thrown. I simply looked at them like they were complete strangers. I pressed the button on my armrest. The tinted glass glided upward, sealing them out of my world forever. Drive, please, I instructed my chauffeur. The Maybach pulled away seamlessly, leaving the Wilson family in its dust. I settled back into the plush leather seat and took a sip of my coffee. The digital dashboard display lit up as the driver turned on the morning news. The sharp, authoritative voice of the local anchor filled the quiet cabin. Breaking news this morning in the financial sector, the anchor announced. Prominent Chicago businessman Richard Wilson and his son-in-law Devin Blackwood are facing massive federal fraud indictments following a dramatic raid last night. Meanwhile, Aegis Capital, the firm that recently acquired the Wilson portfolio, has just released a public statement pledging a $50 million investment to revitalize the city's abandoned commercial districts. I clicked off the radio, the satisfying click echoing the finality settling in my chest. The car glided smoothly toward downtown Chicago, carrying me away from the toxic wasteland of my past and directly into the future I had meticulously engineered. A week later, the air inside the main atrium of the former Richard Center tasted of ozone and pulverized concrete. I stood in the center of the massive marble lobby, my hands clasped loosely behind my back, watching a crew of men in hard hats suspended on hydraulic lifts 50 feet in the air. Sparks rained down like golden fireworks as welding torches sliced through the thick steel bolts, anchoring the giant gold-plated letters of Richard Wilson's name to the central feature wall. With a groan of yielding metal, the massive W detached. It plummeted downward, slamming onto the protective drop cloths below with a deafening crash that reverberated through the cavernous space. The sound was incredibly satisfying. "Good riddance," Arthur Sterling murmured, stepping up beside me and handing me a sleek leather-bound portfolio. "The transition of the remaining commercial deeds has been fully finalized, Madeline. The frozen accounts have been completely liquidated to cover the outstanding debts, and the SEC has formally seized the rest of Richard and Devin's offshore holdings. They are currently sharing a holding cell at the Federal Detention Center downtown. Ashley has reportedly moved into a budget motel near the airport after her credit cards were flagged for fraud." I nodded, taking the portfolio. The destruction of their lives brought me no malicious joy, only a profound clinical sense of justice. They had built their entire existence on a foundation of theft and manipulation. Gravity had simply done the rest. "Look up," Madeline, Arthur instructed, pointing toward the newly cleared marble wall. "The installation crew is ready." I tilted my head back as another lift ascended carrying a pristine brushed steel plaque. The workers secured it to the marble, drilling the bolts into place with sharp mechanical bursts. When they pulled away the protective film, the gleaming new letters caught the morning sunlight streaming through the skylights. The Arthur Vance Center. My biological father's name was finally restored to the exact place it belonged. He was no longer a buried secret or a footnote in Richard's fraudulent success story. He was the literal foundation of this empire, and the entire city of Chicago would now know his legacy. "But we are not just changing the name," I stated, turning to face Arthur and the core executive team of Aegis Capital who had gathered behind us. "This building will no longer serve as a monument to corporate greed. We are dedicating the entire lower concourse and the first 5 floors to a new initiative. I am establishing the Vance Innovation Incubator. It will be backed by a $50 million grant directly from my personal equity." The executives listened intently, taking notes as I outlined the vision. "This space will provide zero equity funding, legal counsel, and premium workspace exclusively for female entrepreneurs." I explained, my voice echoing with absolute authority. Specifically, we will prioritize women who are rebuilding their lives after escaping financial abuse and domestic control. We will give them the resources, the network, and the capital they need to become entirely self-sufficient. We are going to build a fortress where women can create their own wealth so they never have to depend on a man like Richard Wilson or Devin Blackwood ever again. The team nodded in enthusiastic agreement. They did not look at me with the patronizing disdain my stepfather had always shown. They looked at me with unfiltered respect. I was not a charity case or a burdensome adopted daughter. I was their CEO, their visionary, and their leader. My smartphone buzzed in my jacket pocket, vibrating against my ribs with a harsh, urgent rhythm. I pulled it out and glanced at the screen. It was an unsaved number, but the area code belonged to a cheap, prepaid mobile carrier. I knew exactly who it was. I held up a finger to my team, signaling them to give me a moment, and stepped away toward the towering glass windows overlooking the street. I answered the call, pressing the phone to my ear, but remaining completely silent. Maddie. Diane's voice crackled through the speaker, thin, reedy, and frantic. The confident, sneering socialite was completely gone, replaced by a desperate, panicked woman running entirely out of options. Maddie, please do not hang up. You have to help me. The feds took everything. The bank froze my emergency accounts. I am staying in a terrifying motel and I cannot even afford to pay the weekly rate. You have so much money now, millions. Please just wire me $10,000, just enough to get an apartment. I am your mother. You cannot leave me on the street. Her voice broke into ragged, ugly sobs, a pathetic attempt to weaponize the maternal bond she had spent 2 decades destroying. I listened to her weep, feeling the familiar heavy pull of the guilt she had installed in my brain since childhood. But the guilt had no teeth anymore. It was just a phantom sensation, completely powerless against the reality of who she truly was. You forfeited the right to call yourself my mother the day you helped a thief steal my father's legacy, I replied, my voice chillingly calm, completely devoid of anger or sorrow. You threw me out into the cold with a garbage bag. You laughed while your husband called me a failure. You made your choices, Diane. Now you get to live with the consequences. Maddie! No, I am begging you, I have nothing. Diane shrieked, the panic escalating into pure hysteria. You have exactly what you earned, I stated with absolute finality. I pulled the phone away from my ear, tapped the red button to end the call, and immediately pressed block. The screen flashed, confirming the number was permanently restricted. I slipped the phone back into my pocket, feeling a massive, invisible weight physically lift from my shoulders. The Wilson family was completely excised from my life. The poison was gone. I turned back to my team. They were waiting for me, files open, eager to begin the real work. I led them toward the private glass elevator, swiping my keycard to access the executive penthouse. The doors parted, revealing a sprawling, sunlit office that encompassed the entire top floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the Chicago skyline and the vast, glittering expanse of Lake Michigan. I walked past the massive oak desk, ignoring the ringing telephones and the digital tickers displaying the surging value of Aegis Capital. I pushed open the heavy glass doors and stepped out onto the expansive private terrace. The wind off the lake was brisk and invigorating, catching my hair and snapping my jacket lapels. I walked to the edge of the balcony and rested my hands on the cool metal railing, looking down at the bustling city below. I had started with absolutely nothing but a stolen laptop and a burning desire for justice. I had faced the people who tried to bury me, and I had systematically dismantled their empire using my own brilliance, relentless determination, and an unwavering refusal to be a victim. I did not wait for a prince to save me, and I did not rely on luck. I built my own armor. I secured my own wealth. I took a deep breath of the crisp Chicago air, feeling the undeniable electric surge of absolute freedom. I was Madeline Vance, the sole heir and the supreme architect of my own destiny. The skyline stretched out before me, endless and full of potential. It was the perfect, undeniable American success story, and it belonged entirely to me. The story of Madeline and the Wilson family teaches us a powerful lesson about the fragility of empires built on deceit. Richard and Diane prioritized greed and manipulation over genuine human connection, stealing a legacy that was never theirs. However, their ultimate downfall proves that truth is an unstoppable force. The incredible journey from a discarded daughter to a triumphant leader demonstrates that true power comes from resilience, patience, and unwavering integrity. You cannot outrun the consequences of your actions forever, and justice always prevails. Please share your own experiences of standing up against toxic individuals, and please comment below.